Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. It was late, but not midnight late. More like that in-between hour when the last of the neighborhood lights go out and everything feels a little emptier. I had just finished cleaning up the kitchen and figured I'd take Max, my shepherd mix, for one last walk before bed. He was restless, pacing near the door, nails clicking on the tile like a clock that wouldn't stop. The air had cooled off after a hot day, one of those muggy August evenings where the ground still radiates warmth but the breeze carries a hint of relief. We usually stuck to the sidewalks, but that night I cut across the open field behind the elementary school. It wasn't a big field, just 2 soccer pitches worth of grass with a tree line at the far end, but it felt quieter than the streets. No cars, no porch lights, no motion sensors clicking on, just the steady chirp of crickets and Max's leash tugging me forward. At first it was perfectly ordinary. Max sniffed the edges of the grass, found a spot, and circled the way dogs do. I stood with my hands in my pockets, watching the night. The stars were out, clearer than usual because the humidity had settled low. I could pick out the Big Dipper easily, and 1 or 2 planes moved steady across the sky. We were about halfway across the field when I heard it. It wasn't loud. More like a hum you feel in your chest before you register it in your ears. A low, steady vibration that seemed to come from above, but not from any specific spot. At first I thought it was a distant generator or maybe an air conditioner somewhere, but the pitch was too even. No sputtering, no mechanical rattle. Just a smooth, low sound like a tuning fork the size of a building. Max froze. He was mid-step, head low, tail stiff. I gave the leash a little pull, but he planted his feet like he was glued to the ground. His ears pinned back, and then he growled. It wasn't his playful growl either. It was the kind he used when someone walked too close to the yard at night. Low, steady, warning. The sound kept going. I turned in a slow circle, trying to pin it down. My first thought was maybe a plane overhead, but when I looked up, the sky was empty except for stars. No blinking lights, no movement. Just that sound pressing down. Max's growl deepened and his body trembled against the leash. I crouched next to him, put a hand on his collar, tried to calm him, but he wouldn't stop staring upward. Not at a particular spot, just upward, as if the whole sky had his attention. I noticed then that the crickets were gone. The sound had swallowed them up, or maybe they'd gone silent. Either way, it made the field feel hollow, like we were the only 2 living things in it. I waited, crouched there with Max, my hand tightening on his collar without meaning to. The hum didn't waver, didn't rise or fall. It just kept on in that exact same pitch. I realized after a while that I couldn't tell how long it had been going. It might have been a minute, maybe 5. Time felt stuck. Max's growl turned into short, sharp barks. He lunged forward once, then stopped himself, then lunged again, as if warning something I couldn't see. His body shook with tension. My first instinct was to drag him back toward the street, but something in me didn't want to move either. It was like the air had thickened, and then the sound stopped. Not faded, not drifted off, stopped. 1 second it was pressing on my chest, vibrating in my teeth, and the next it was gone. Just air. The silence afterward was the kind that makes your ears ring. It felt too big, too empty. Max went quiet too, but not in a relieved way. His ears stayed back, his body rigid. He sniffed the air hard, pacing in tight circles around me, leash taut. His hackles stayed raised. I stood there waiting for something to happen, for the source of it to show itself. Nothing did. The stars were the same. The trees at the edge of the field didn't move, and the houses beyond were quiet. After a while, the crickets came back, hesitant at first, then louder until the field sounded normal again. Max finally relaxed enough to lower his tail, but he kept glancing upward, pulling at the leash like he wanted out of the field immediately. So we went. I let him drag me back toward the sidewalk, my shoes scuffing on the grass because I wasn't paying attention to where I stepped. Back under the streetlights, things felt almost ordinary again. Porch lights glowed, a car passed on the next block, and the hum might as well have been a dream. Except Max kept looking over his shoulder the entire way home, ears twitching, body tense. When we got back inside, he went straight to his crate without me telling him to, curled tight, and stayed there the rest of the night. Normally, he'd sprawl on the rug until I went to bed, but not that night. I kept listening, waiting for the sound to start again, but the house was silent except for the tick of the fridge and the occasional sigh of the AC. I even stepped outside once more before bed, stood on the porch, looked out at the field. Everything was calm. Crickets loud, air heavy and warm, sky still, nothing else happened. But I can still remember how the sound felt, more than how it sounded, like a weight pressing down from nowhere, like the whole sky had leaned in close and then pulled back just as quick. I was working the night shift at a distribution warehouse just outside of Toledo. The building wasn't huge, 2 long aisles stacked with pallets, a loading dock on one end, and an office up front. But at night, it always felt bigger than it really was. My shift ran from 11 to 7, and most of my job was just walking laps inside and around the perimeter, checking doors and keeping an eye on the cameras. That night was cold and clear. January. The kind of night where the air stings your nose and every sound feels sharper. I'd already done 2 full rounds, and by around 2 in the morning, I was halfway through another walk across the main floor. My flashlight was mostly for comfort. Motion sensors kept the place dimly lit. I was between the shelves when it happened. The floor in front of me lit up. Not a little, not like a flicker from the overheads, but bright. So bright I froze mid-step. It swept across the concrete in a wide band, moving smoothly like a massive spotlight had passed overhead. The shadow of the shelving units stretched long across the aisle, sharp-edged, as if the light source had been right above the roof. I jerked my head up. The warehouse lights hadn't changed. The fluorescents hummed like they always did, nothing brighter than before. But the glow on the floor was real. It slid forward past me, toward the loading dock, then blinked out. I just stood there, heart pounding, listening for something. An engine maybe, or the thump of rotor blades. Nothing. After maybe 10 seconds, I set my flashlight beam to the floor, like that would explain it. The concrete looked normal. I walked fast toward the dock, climbed the steps, and hit the door release. The big overhead door rattled upward, letting in a blast of freezing air. The lot outside was empty. I stepped down onto the pavement and craned my neck up at the sky, perfectly clear. Stars scattered everywhere, a thin sliver of moon low on the horizon. No planes, no helicopters, not even the usual rumble of trucks on the highway a mile away. I must have stood out there for a full minute, my breath hanging in front of me, waiting for the sound of something pulling away. It never came. When I finally shut the dock door and went back inside, everything looked exactly the same. Pallets wrapped in plastic, forklifts parked against the wall, gleamed like nothing out of place. I tried to shake it off and finish the round, but my skin stayed prickled, like static. About half an hour later, I was in the security office watching the monitors, rewinding the footage to the time when the light had swept through. The cameras caught it, but it didn't look like a spotlight. It wasn't a clean beam. It was more like the whole floor surface had glowed for a few seconds, brightest in one spot and then spreading out. The shadows of the shelves had warped and stretched as if the source was shifting position directly overhead. Then, just like I'd seen in person, it winked out. No transition. One frame lit, the next frame dark again. I leaned closer to the monitor, trying to spot some sign of an explanation. Dust in the air, a reflection, a glitch in the feed. But the glow had weight to it. You could see how it bent around corners and reflected off the shrink wrap. It wasn't digital noise. And then I noticed something I hadn't caught before. In the few seconds before the sweep, one of the cameras outside on the north wall flickered. Just a little static ripple, like interference. When the glow appeared inside, that feed went black for exactly 3 seconds, then came back clean. I grabbed my coat and flashlight and went out the side door to check the lot again. The north side was just gravel and chain link fence. Beyond that was a patch of woods, skeletal trees bare from winter. I swept the beam across the tree line. Nothing, just branches moving faintly in the breeze. But as I stood there, I realized the silence was the same as earlier. Not total, but heavy, like the night was waiting. Usually you'd hear at least a distant dog barking or traffic hum from the highway. Right then, it felt sealed off. I backed inside, locked the door behind me, and sat in the office staring at the monitors. For the rest of the shift, I kept expecting something else to happen. Another sweep of light, a sound, anything. But the warehouse stayed normal. By the time the morning shift arrived, I was so wired I barely said a word to anyone. I went home, laid down in bed, and kept replaying the moment when the shadows stretched across the floor. That bright, silent wash of light moving with no source. I can still picture it clear as the night it happened. It was late in the summer when my girlfriend and I decided to take her uncle's boat out on the lake. His place was up in northern Minnesota, not far from the Canadian border. We'd been there for a week already, spending the days fishing, swimming, and drinking cheap beer on the dock. That night, though, the lake was completely calm, the kind of glassy stillness you only get on windless nights when the air feels heavy. The moon was new, so it was almost pitch black out there. We figured it good night to just drift, watch the stars, maybe see some meteors. Her name's Carla, and she loved being out on the water more than I did. I get jumpy when it's too dark, but she insisted we bring the boat out anyway. We packed a small cooler, a blanket, and a cheap lantern we didn't even end up using because we wanted to keep our eyes adjusted to the dark. By around midnight, we'd made our way a few hundred yards offshore. You couldn't see any other boats. The cabins on the shoreline had all gone quiet except for one porch light way down to the south. At first, everything was normal. We lay on our backs on the bench seats, pointing out constellations. The Milky Way was visible, stretching clear across the sky. Every once in a while, we'd hear a loon calling somewhere in the distance, that weird echoing sound they make. The air was cool enough that you could see your breath if you exhaled hard. I don't know exactly when it started, but at some point I noticed the water wasn't as dark as it should have been. At first I thought maybe my eyes were playing tricks, like when you stare at black water too long and you start to think you see shapes. But this wasn't that. It was more like a faint glow, just under the surface, maybe 20 or 30 feet off the starboard side. Carla noticed it too. She asked if I dropped the lantern overboard. The glow got brighter. Not like a spotlight, more like the water itself was lit up from underneath. It didn't move with the waves. It was steady, circular, maybe the size of a pickup truck bed. We both just sat there watching it, not sure what we were looking at. Then the surface of the water broke, and something rose up. At first, I thought it was a huge bubble, like gas from the bottom of the lake. But it kept going, higher than it should have, and it didn't pop. It was a sphere, glowing faintly white, almost like frosted glass with a light inside, completely silent. No splashing, no sound at all, even though the water dripped off it in sheets. It hovered just above the surface, maybe 10 feet up. I couldn't see through it, but it didn't look solid either. It gave off enough light that the boat's metal railing gleamed, and the ripples on the lake spread out in perfect circles around it. My brain tried to come up with explanations. Phosphorescence, some kind of weather balloon, headlights reflecting from shore, but none of it made sense. Carla squeezed my arm so hard her nails dug in. I remember she whispered, "Do you hear that?" I told her I didn't hear anything, but she insisted there was this low hum, like a vibration in her chest. I started to think maybe I felt it too, but it was so faint I couldn't be sure if it was real or just me psyching myself out. The sphere hung there for less than a minute, though it felt longer. Neither of us moved. I was afraid if I even shifted my weight, the boat would creak and break, whatever was happening. Then, without warning, it shot straight up. No arc, no acceleration curve. It was like it went from still to gone in an instant. 1 second, it was over the water. The next, it was a pinpoint of light racing into the sky until it blended in with the stars. The lake was dead silent again. No loons, no insects, nothing. The ripples faded and the water went back to being flat and black. Carla let go of my arm and I realized my shirt sleeve was damp from where her hand had been sweating. We stayed out there for maybe 10 more minutes. Too stunned to say much. Every little sound, a fish splashing, the boat knocking against a wave, made both of us jump. Finally, I started the motor and steered us back toward her uncle's dock. The ride back felt like it took forever. When we got in, we tied off the boat and went straight inside without saying a word to anyone. Her uncle's dog, who usually barked like crazy when we came in late, didn't make a sound. It just sat in the corner with its ears back, staring at the floor. Carla didn't want to talk about it at all that night. She poured herself 2 fingers of whiskey, downed it, and went straight to bed. I sat in the dark living room for a while, trying to process what we'd seen. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that sphere lifting out of the water, perfectly smooth, perfectly silent, like it had been waiting down there the whole time. Neither of us mentioned it to her uncle the next morning. We just acted tired, like we'd stayed out too late. A couple of times I thought about asking around the lake, seeing if anyone else had spotted anything strange, but I couldn't figure out how to bring it up without sounding like I'd lost it. Carla and I broke up a year later, unrelated reasons, but the last time we talked, she brought it up. She asked if I remembered that night on the lake. I told her I did. Of course I did. And she got quiet. Then she said she still wasn't sure if we'd actually seen it or if she'd dreamed it somehow, even though we both remembered the exact same thing. I haven't been back to that lake since. I left the diner later than I planned that night, probably around 11:30 p.m., and the sky was cloudless, unusually crisp for early September in northern Wisconsin. The roads were mostly empty back there, thin ribbons of asphalt winding through cornfields and patches of woods. I was on my bike, my headlights cutting narrow paths through the dark, and the night smelled of wet earth from the rain that had stopped a few hours earlier. At first, everything was normal. I'd just been pedaling along County Road F, listening to the sound of the tires on the asphalt and the occasional cricket hidden somewhere in the fields. My mind was on nothing in particular. I was tired, thinking about the bills I still needed to pay, the argument that I'd had with my roommate, the usual mundane stuff that floats in and out of my head. Then I noticed the moon. It wasn't bright in that harsh, blinding way, but soft and pale. The weird thing was that it looked split. Not like a crescent or a phase, but physically divided. 2 shapes. One was more like the regular moon, the other a faint copy hovering just to the east, slightly blurred at the edges. I slowed down, trying to convince myself it was a trick of my eyes, maybe moisture in my glasses or the lingering fog near the cornfields. I stopped on the shoulder, resting one foot on the ground. The 2 moons stayed there, still, impossible, quiet. The duplicate moon wasn't identical. It seemed thinner, somehow, more like a curved light, hovering rather than a solid shape. I rubbed my eyes and blinked, but the effect didn't go away. As I watched, the faint moon started drifting. Not fast, not like a plane or satellite, but slowly, steadily across the horizon. I could see it moving past the silhouette of the trees, and then after a few minutes, it just faded. No sudden blink or disappearance, just a thinning of light until it was gone entirely. The regular moon remained in place, untouched. I got back on my bike, uneasy, pedaling a little faster. My hands felt sticky, though the air was cool. I kept glancing up at the sky, half expecting it to happen again. But nothing. Only the steady, normal moon. By the time I reached the bridge over the creek, I noticed other odd things. The insects, crickets, frogs, whatever else usually filled the air, were silent. I mean, completely silent. Even the occasional rustle of leaves was gone. It was like the world had paused, holding its breath. I stopped again, listening. No wind, no water, nothing. Just the faint hum of my bike tires on the wet asphalt. Then I noticed something else. Shadows on the roadside, flickering and moving independently of the trees. I thought maybe it was my imagination, but the shapes were long, thin, and stretched across the fields in ways the trees couldn't make. I squinted and moved my head from side to side. They didn't respond to my movement. They just shifted subtly, almost as if they were alive. I told myself it was probably fog settling in patches over the field, or reflections of the moon on wet corn stalks. But the rationalizations felt hollow. My stomach was tightening, my chest feeling oddly heavy. I pedaled faster, the beams from my headlights skimming the ground and catching the edges of the cornfields. Every time I thought I saw movement in the shadows, my pulse jumped. Somewhere along that stretch, I started hearing a faint, high-pitched tone. Not music, not like a machine, more like a single, drawn-out hum, soft and distant, impossible to locate. I slowed, listening carefully, trying to figure out if it was in my ears or in the air. It wasn't wind or crickets. It was consistent, hovering just above the tree line, moving slightly with the contour of the road. When I looked up, all I could see was the regular moon and a sky full of stars. The tone lingered for maybe a minute, then vanished as suddenly as it came. I shook my head, telling myself I was overtired, imagining things because of the dark and the isolation. But the split moon and the drifting shadow shapes had been real. I couldn't convince myself otherwise. The rest of the ride home was uneventful, though I kept glancing over my shoulder and up at the sky. Every now and then, I thought I saw a thin glow in the distance, moving just at the edge of vision, but when I focused, it disappeared. The world felt slightly off. Not dangerous, not hostile, just wrong in a way I couldn't describe. By the time I got to my driveway, the normal sounds of crickets and distant night birds had returned. The fields were quiet but alive again, shadows behaving normally, and the sky was empty except for the single familiar moon. I locked my bike in the garage and went inside, my hands still shaking a little, and tried to push it out of my mind. Made a cup of tea, kept glancing out the window, waiting for a hint of that drifting light or that hum, but nothing came. The next morning, the sky was clear, the air smelled of fresh dew, and everything was completely normal. I told my roommate about it while we had coffee, and he laughed, said maybe I'd been looking at airplane lights or something. But I knew what I saw, or at least what I thought I saw. It hasn't happened again. I've biked that route dozens of times since, always at night, always on the same stretch. Nothing. No split moon, no drifting lights, no sudden silence. But sometimes when the wind is still and the air feels heavy in a certain way, I swear I catch a faint glow at the corner of my vision, and my stomach tightens just a little. I got up around 4:30 that morning, earlier than usual, because the lake tends to be quiet and still at dawn, and I like that for fishing. The mist was thick over the water, rolling low along the shore, and the air smelled like wet earth and pine. My name's Carl. I live on the outskirts of Prescott, Idaho, and I fish here most mornings before work. I usually bring 2 rods and a thermos of coffee, park my truck near the dock, and just let the morning settle over me. That day felt different immediately. The fog was heavier than usual, clinging to my jacket, dripping off the brim of my hat. I tossed my line in, listened to the soft slap of water, the occasional plop of a fish jumping somewhere off in the distance. Everything seemed normal at first. Then I noticed it. At first, it was subtle, like the water was reflecting the dim light of dawn in odd patterns. I squinted and realized there were 3 lights reflected on the water's surface, small, steady, bright, too precise to be a fish's splash or the sun filtering through the mist. They moved slowly, almost gliding across the ripples, not following any wind or current I could see. I frowned and looked up. The sky was a pale gray, overcast with the dawn light struggling through. Nothing else. No planes, no birds, no other lights. I shook my head, thinking it might be my eyes adjusting to the mist, but the reflections kept moving, evenly spaced, like 3 little points traveling together in formation. I got up and walked to the edge of the dock. The movement was smooth, deliberate, slow enough that I could follow it with my gaze. I scanned the tree line, expecting to see someone with a lantern, maybe a passing boat out of view, but there was nothing. Only the fog and the lake and the faint hum of morning insects just starting to wake. I sat back down, trying to rationalize it. Maybe the mist was playing tricks, reflecting something from the trees or my own truck lights. But my truck was off, and the dock had no lights except a single dim bulb that I'd forgotten to turn on. And the lights, they didn't flicker or jump like a reflection normally would. They moved with precision, a straight, steady drift across the water. For several minutes, I watched them. My coffee had cooled in the thermos, forgotten. Every instinct in me was telling me this wasn't normal, and yet I couldn't look away. My mind tried to fill in explanations. Distant boat lights, sunrise hitting something in the trees, some optical illusion caused by the fog, but nothing fit. Then the oddest part happened. One of the lights paused, just for a second, then drifted slightly ahead, like it was aware I was watching. I blinked, and the light fell back into formation with the other 2. My pulse picked up. I looked around the shore again, feeling the isolation more strongly, There wasn't another car, no other fishermen, not even a bird in sight. The reflection continued for maybe 10 minutes. I lost track of time. It felt longer. I could hear the water lapping gently against the dock, the creak of the wooden boards beneath me, but nothing else disturbed the calm. I finally forced myself to stand, stretch, shake off the tension in my legs, and the reflections were still there, moving slowly. I decided to test it. I grabbed a small flashlight from my tackle box and waved it over the water, thinking maybe I could see what the reflections were bouncing off. The light hit the surface, and for a brief moment, the reflections seemed to ripple, but they didn't vanish. They shifted slightly, almost like the water itself acknowledged the movement. And then, as if someone flipped a switch, they disappeared. Just like that. No flash, no ripple, no trace. Only the gray water reflecting the dull dawn sky. I sat back down on the dock, breathing hard, trying to collect myself. Everything else felt normal. The mist, the birds starting to call, the occasional splash from a waking fish. But the three lights were gone. I looked at my lines, then at the horizon, expecting something else to appear, some clue or continuation of the phenomenon, but nothing. I packed up shortly after. My hands were still shaking slightly, and I kept glancing over my shoulder as I loaded the rods into the truck. The whole drive back into town, I kept looking at the lake through the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the reflections again, hovering silently in the early light. But it was just fog and trees and empty water. When I got home, I told my wife, Linda, what happened. She was patient, listening, but I could tell she thought I was reading too much into the morning fog. Maybe I was. Maybe it was just light reflecting off the ripples in a strange way. I even tried to convince myself later that it was a trick of the eyes, something caused by being half asleep, half awake in the gray dawn light. But the feeling didn't go away. For weeks after, I avoided fishing at first light, took the later routes to work, and kept glancing at the sky when I drove past the lake. Every now and then, I'd swear I saw a faint, brief glimmer on the water, just for a second, and it was enough to make me slow down, tense up, and wonder if I'd see those three lights again. I've been back since, a couple times when the lake was foggy and still, but nothing appeared. Just the same gray water, the same trees, the same calm morning noises. And yet, when I think about that dawn, the image of the three lights moving together across the water stays with me. I don't know what I saw. It could have been reflections, tricks of the fog, or my imagination stretched by the quiet and isolation. But part of me remembers it as real, solid in a way that nothing else that morning was. I tell myself it was a mistake, a brief anomaly in the calm of the lake. But even now, when I wake before sunrise, I glance toward the water, half hoping I won't see it again, half hoping I might. I left my friend's place later than I wanted to, around 10:45 p.m., and the back roads were quiet, almost unnervingly so. I live out near the edge of town in northern Vermont, so once you get past the last few streetlights, it's just fields and woods, black and still at night. My bike lights cut narrow paths ahead, nothing more, and the air smelled damp from the drizzle that had stopped a couple hours before. At first, it was normal. I pedaled along Route 128, the hum of the tires on asphalt, the occasional hoot of an owl somewhere deep in the trees, the distant barking of a dog. My mind wandered, thinking about work the next day, the laundry I'd forgotten, nothing unusual. Then I noticed the moon. I've always looked at the sky while biking at night. It's one of the few times I feel alone and calm, but this was different. The moon looked like it had split in two. Not a phase or a cloud covering part of it, but literally two separate shapes. One looked like the normal moon, the soft yellow-white glow I expected. The other was fainter, slightly blurred, like someone had traced a second moon just beside it. I slowed, gripping the handlebars tighter. Maybe I was tired, or maybe my glasses had fogged, but blinking and rubbing my eyes didn't make it go away. I stopped completely on the shoulder, the tires crunching on gravel. The faint moon hovered there, unmoving, while the real one stayed in its place. Then, it started to drift. Very slowly, almost imperceptibly, it slid east across the horizon. I watched it move past the silhouette of the tree line, past the edge of a cornfield. Nothing else moved. No clouds, no wind, just the soft, impossible motion of that second moon. And then as gradually as it had appeared, it faded. There wasn't a sudden blink or disappearance. It just thinned until it wasn't there anymore, leaving only the original moon. I swallowed hard and got back on the bike, trying to make sense of it. My hands felt sticky and clammy, even though the air was cool. I kept glancing back over my shoulder, half expecting the second moon to return. It didn't. A mile down the road, near the small bridge over the creek, I noticed something else. All the usual night sounds, crickets, frogs, the rustle of leaves, had stopped. Total silence. It wasn't like a lull in activity either. Everything seemed paused. I stopped again, resting one foot on the ground, and listened. Nothing. The air itself felt heavy, still. Then I noticed shadows, long, thin shapes stretching across the fields at odd angles, moving subtly, shifting in ways that didn't match the trees or the crops. I tilted my head, squinting, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the dim light. But they didn't obey the logic of light and shadow. They moved independent of everything around them. I pedaled faster, the beam from my front light sweeping the roadside, catching the edges of corn and grass. Every time I thought I saw movement in those shadows, my pulse jumped. And then came the sound. A faint, high-pitched hum, low in volume but clear in tone. Not mechanical, not musical. Just a soft vibration in the air, like a single note held far away. I froze, listening, trying to figure out if it was my imagination, my heart, or something else. The hum stayed, drifting slightly overhead along the road. I looked up. Stars, the steady moon, nothing else. The hum vanished abruptly, leaving the quiet night behind. I shook my head, telling myself I'd been looking too long at the sky, that the shadows and the sound were products of isolation and fatigue. But I knew what I'd seen. The split moon, the drifting light, the odd silence, the shifting shadows. I rode the rest of the way home faster, glancing around constantly. At one point, I thought I caught a faint glow at the edge of my vision, moving just out of focus, but when I turned to look directly, it was gone. My stomach tightened. I felt like the world had briefly tilted out of alignment, like I'd glimpsed something not meant to be seen. By the time I reached my driveway, the normal night sounds had returned. The crickets were chirping, leaves rustled in the breeze, and the sky looked ordinary again. I locked my bike in the garage, went inside, and tried to shake it off, making tea and keeping an eye on the sky through the window. But every now and then, in the still moments, I could swear I felt the faint weight of that drifting light at the edge of my vision. The next morning, everything looked normal. The air smelled fresh with dew, the fields glistened, and the sky was empty except for the single regular moon. I told a friend about it later, and she laughed it off, said I must have been tired or imagining things. Maybe I was, but biking that same stretch now, months later, I sometimes catch a flicker in the corner of my vision, a faint shimmer that doesn't belong. It vanishes before I can focus, but it's enough to make me grip the handlebars tighter and pedal a little faster, half hoping it won't follow. I set up camp late that evening along a small ridge just outside Cedar Hollow. The wind had died down, leaving the air crisp and still, and I was glad. Makes starting a fire a hell of a lot easier. My name's Ethan, and I usually do solo trips like this to disconnect, think, and maybe catch some peace before work drains me all week. I'd gotten here around 9, pitched my tent, stacked some wood, and started a small fire near the rock outcrop that offered a decent view of the valley below. By midnight, the fire was down to glowing embers. I had my headlamp on, reading a worn-out trail guide, and for a while, everything felt normal. A little too quiet, maybe. The kind of quiet where you notice the sound of leaves shifting, even when there's no wind. I must have dozed off because when I woke, it felt like morning. I blinked at the wristwatch on my left arm. It read 3:14 a.m. I knew I had checked it before sleeping. It was around 1 a.m. The numbers were bright against the dark face, clear as day. I sat up, feeling groggy, and immediately reached for the fire. It was still alive, crackling gently, smoke curling into the cold night. I'd have sworn I'd left it burning low, maybe 20 minutes before. That's impossible, right? 2 hours had passed according to the watch, but the fire didn't look like it had. I shook my head, thinking maybe I'd misread the time before nodding off. But no, the wristwatch was definitely showing 3:14, and it had that subtle glow you get when the hands pass the luminous markers. I even reset it in my head against the last time I'd checked before bed. It didn't match. I tried to shake off the unease and decided to step outside the tent for a breath of cold air. The ridge was silent. Normally, at this hour, even in Cedar Hollow, you get a distant owl, a fox calling, something to break the stillness. But this night, nothing, not even the rustle of leaves. My boots crunched over frost-dusted soil as I circled the fire, and the silence pressed down in a way that made my ears ring slightly. I sat back down, trying to rationalize. Maybe my watch had a glitch. Maybe I'd nodded off in bursts I didn't remember. I poured some water from my bottle into a tin cup and sipped, thinking the warmth would calm me. That's when I noticed a faint glow across the tree line at the base of the ridge. It was subtle, pale, like the faintest reflection of moonlight, but the moon was still high and bright. No clouds, no haze. The glow shifted slightly, almost gliding, not flickering like a fire. I squinted, and it seemed to retreat as I watched, then reappear further along the line of trees, as if it was moving against some invisible current. My stomach tightened. I stood, scanning the valley, wondering if I was seeing headlights from some distant road. There wasn't one for miles, and no sound, no hum, nothing. Just that movement of light. I told myself it had to be some animal, maybe reflecting the moon, but the motion was too fluid, deliberate even. I retreated back into the tent, shaking slightly. The fire crackled, almost teasingly. The embers didn't look like they'd changed at all. I checked my watch again. 3:18 a.m. 4 minutes had passed. I kept glancing at the tree line. The glow had stopped moving, just hanging faintly over a copse of pine, like it was watching. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the tent fabric. I froze. Then it went still again, and with it all the tiny night sounds vanished. The usual crickets, the rustle of small animals in underbrush, even the distant creak of trees. Nothing. Total quiet, heavier than before. I realized I'd been holding my breath. I unzipped the flap just enough to peek. The glow was gone. I leaned forward, eyes straining, trying to see through the dark. The forest looked normal. Frost glittered faintly under moonlight. I blinked, and the fire seemed unnaturally bright again, as if I'd never stepped away. I retreated into the tent, pulling the flap closed. I sat against the sleeping bag, staring at the watch. 3:19 a.m., I counted out loud just to anchor myself. Every time I blinked, I half expected the glow to reappear, and every time, nothing. The next hours passed slowly. I tried to sleep, but every time I drifted, I felt like something brushed the edges of awareness, the faintest whisper of movement just beyond the firelight. Sometimes I thought I saw a shadow shift among the trees, but when I focused, there was nothing. I didn't hear animals, I didn't hear wind, I didn't hear the occasional hoot or rustle, nothing but my own breathing and the fire crackling. Eventually, dawn arrived. Light spilled over the valley, revealing frost on every branch, and a landscape that looked completely ordinary. No glow, no shadows out of place, no unusual shapes in the trees. The fire was finally down to ashes. I packed up slowly, half expecting another anomaly to appear while I worked. None did. Driving home later, I kept glancing at my watch, checking against the dashboard clock. Everything synchronized perfectly now, but the memory of the fire and the faint glow made the day feel off balance. Even telling myself it was a glitch, a dream, or my mind playing tricks didn't settle the unease. At home, I set up the watch on the counter. It ticks normally, nothing strange. Yet sometimes, when the night is still and the wind has died, I swear I can feel the pause between hours, like time bending slightly, and I half expect to see that pale glow drifting silently through the trees again. Even after months, I can't explain the 2-hour jump or the still burning fire. I can't explain the light or the silence. And the part that unsettles me the most? The forest felt like it knew I was awake, like it had waited while the world skipped 2 hours and then let me go. I was on the 11:45 freight out of Fairview, heading east toward the plains. Name's Marcus. I've been a conductor for nearly 15 years, and I thought I'd seen everything there is to see on these tracks, until that night. The weather had turned cold overnight. Frost was still clinging to the rails and the sleepers, and the wind had dropped just enough to make the air feel heavier, almost sticky. I was riding in the cab alone for most of the route. The engineer, Dave, had gone to the mess car for a quick break. leaving me to keep an eye on the gauges and the tracks. It was dark, pitch dark, except for the faint glow of the console lights and the occasional reflection off the frost. I like these quiet stretches, the kind where you can hear the wheels on the rails and nothing else. That's when it started. At first, it was just a flicker off to the side, something bright in the corner of my eye. I turned toward it and caught a single, intense light pacing alongside the train. Fast, impossibly fast, far faster than anything could keep up with us without catching a blur. I pinched my eyes, leaned forward, and the light matched every movement of the train, staying level with the cars like it was tethered to us. I called out to Dave when he came back into the cab. "Hey, you seeing this?" I said. He shook his head. "Seeing what?" "The light, right there." I pointed out the window, trying to keep my voice calm, like though my stomach had tightened. Dave leaned over, looked, and shook his head again. "Marcus, it's dark. Nothing out there but trees and frost. You been up all night? Getting tired?" I laughed, but it wasn't funny. I watched the light dart alongside us, keeping perfect pace, flickering slightly like it was alive. It wasn't stationary, and it wasn't the moon reflecting off something. It was moving with purpose, and there was no noise, no hint of an engine, no shape, just a pure, white, steady glow. We had a few passengers on the train, mostly in the sleeper cars, heading home after a late shift in the city. I ran through the car doors during a brief stop at a siding to check if anyone else had seen it. Nobody did. They were tired, some half asleep. One couple even argued about the train being late. "What light?" one of them asked. "You dreaming again, Marcus?" I started to question myself, but the light was still there, pacing alongside as if aware of me watching it. I went back to the cab, told Dave I didn't know what to make of it. He just muttered, "Keep your eyes on the tracks." I did, but I couldn't stop glancing out the window. It followed us for nearly 10 miles, moving along the tree line, sometimes flicking ahead of a curve, sometimes lagging behind, but never vanishing, never slowing. I tried to measure speed. Think logically. There was no way something that fast could stay aligned with the train without being some kind of aircraft. But the tracks cut through dense woods, too tight for a plane. And it was silent, completely silent. At one point, the light seemed to dip closer to the ground, hovering near a creek that ran parallel to the tracks. I could see the frost reflecting in its glow. It was so unnerving that I swallowed hard and leaned back. For the first time in years, my hands trembled on the throttle. By the time we reached the next station, the light slowed slightly, then, without warning, shot upward, straight into the dark sky. I blinked. It was gone. No flare, no afterimage, nothing. Just the empty tree line, dark and ordinary, like whatever had been there had never existed. I went into the sleeper car again, asked passengers if they'd noticed anything unusual. "Nope. Nothing out here. You okay, Marcus?" They were polite, but their responses made me feel uneasy. None of them had seen it. It wasn't just my imagination. I could feel that. But the fact that no one else saw it, that it hadn't registered on the engineer or any passenger, made it feel like I had somehow been singled out. The ride home after that was heavy with silence. I kept checking the side of the train, expecting it to reappear, and every time the trees passed, I half expected that bright white pulse to streak alongside. Dave didn't comment on it again, and I didn't want to push. I felt ridiculous. I'm a grown man who has spent decades around rails and engines, and here I was, describing a light moving at impossible speeds that didn't exist for anyone else. Later that night, after dropping the train off and shutting down the cab, I sat in the empty yard, the freight cars lined up, the engines cooled. The memory of the light was vivid, like it had burned a pattern into my eyes. I thought about it constantly over the next few days, retracing the route, trying to figure out a rational explanation. I considered headlights reflecting off the frost, distant airplanes, but nothing fit. The light had moved perfectly in parallel, accelerated faster than anything I could identify, and vanished without a trace. I've been back on the route since. The tree line looks the same, the frost forms the same way in early winter, the tracks are the same. Nothing else has ever appeared like that. I talk about it occasionally with other conductors, but most of them laugh or chalk it up to fatigue, a trick of the light, or stress. Even so, I know what I saw. I don't try to chase it or watch at night anymore. I've learned to keep my eyes on the tracks, to focus on the rails and the signals. And sometimes late at night, when I'm alone in the cab and the sky is clear, I glance to the side out of habit, half expecting that impossible light to pace alongside me again, moving silently, deliberately, just out of reach of anyone else's eyes. I was on night watch, the kind that drags on slower than anything else you've done, out at Fort Delaney, a small, mostly overlooked training post tucked into the edge of the Appalachian foothills. My name's Ryan Cole, 28, just shy of my third year in the Army, and I'd done my fair share of late-night perimeter patrols. Usually, nights were boring, just the hum of crickets and the occasional distant truck on the logging road. Not that night. It started around 1:30. My buddy, Sergeant Marcus Hale, and I were stationed in our usual tower post, binoculars slung over our shoulders. The moon was thin, just a sliver, and the fog had started creeping through the trees, low and wet against the ground. I swear, the way the fog rolled made the tree line look alive, like it was breathing. I shifted on the cold metal bench, rubbing my hands. My coffee had gone cold hours ago. I was scanning the tree line when I noticed it. A light hovering just above the canopy, faint but distinct. Not like a flashlight or a flare. It had a soft white glow, and it stayed in one spot, not flickering like a firefly, not moving like a plane. I raised my binoculars, focused. It didn't come closer or retreat. It just stayed. Hovering. "Marcus," I said, tapping him on the shoulder. He turned, frowning. "What?" he asked. "Look at that, over the pines, just hovering." I handed him the binoculars. He leaned over, squinting, his brow furrowed. "I see it," he said, slow. "That's weird. You sure that's not one of the training drones?" I shook my head. "No drones are this high, and they don't hover like that. You see it?" He nodded but stayed quiet, watching. I kept my gaze on it, binoculars pressed to my eyes. It didn't move. Not a centimeter. There was a slight shimmer around the edges, like heat rising off asphalt, but the air was cold, almost biting. "Could be some kind of aircraft," Marcus said eventually. "But it's silent." "Yeah," I said, lowering my binoculars slowly. "Too silent." The weirdest part happened then. When I lowered my eyes, the light was gone. Just the tree line, dark and still. I rubbed my eyes, scanned back and forth, nothing. "It vanished," I said quietly. Marcus frowned. "What vanished?" "The light." He shook his head slowly. "It's still there, right over that ridge." He pointed, and I blinked, looked again. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. "You're messing with me," I said, gripping the rail of the tower. "I don't see anything." "I swear," he said, voice low. "It's right there. You just looked away too long." I felt a cold twist in my stomach, not fear, exactly, just unease. We stared in silence. My hands were clammy, my ears picking up every little sound, the distant groan of the wind through the pines, the scrape of a branch, the low hum of some unseen insect, but no light. I picked the binoculars back up. Nothing. Just fog curling over the trees, the horizon empty. Marcus frowned again. "That's gone now." "Yeah," I said, trying to sound normal. Must have been a trick of the fog or my eyes. He didn't look convinced. Neither did I, really. We stayed at the post for another 2 hours. My mind kept flicking back to that light. Every time I tried to explain it to myself, a distant satellite, a reflection, a training flare, it just didn't fit. No satellite stays still, no reflection floats in the fog at treetop level, and the Army doesn't do late-night flares over the range without telling anyone. Marcus and I rotated patrols. I walked the perimeter a few times, flashlight sweeping the tree line, ears straining for anything out of place. Once, I thought I saw it again, just a faint glimmer at the corner of my eye, but when I spun toward it, there was nothing. Just the fog and trees, silent and cold. By the time dawn started to tint the sky with gray, I was exhausted. Marcus and I swapped notes quietly, neither of us quite knowing what to say. I kept glancing at the ridge where I thought I'd seen it. The fog had burned off, the tree line just trees. Nothing hovering. Nothing at all. Back in the barracks, I tried to tell myself it was exhaustion. Military life plays tricks on your mind. Long nights, repetitive sounds, monotony. Your eyes play games, your brain fills in gaps. Still, I couldn't shake the memory of how precise it had hovered, how quiet it was, the unnatural way it simply vanished when I looked away. Weeks passed. Night watches continued. Nothing ever returned. Yet every time I climbed that tower, I kept expecting it. Every patrol I walked, I kept scanning the ridgeline. I even joked with Marcus sometimes, "Hey, Maybe it's just waiting for us to catch it." He never laughed. I never told anyone else. You try telling a story like that in the military, people assume you're sleep deprived or overworked or trying to impress. But Marcus saw it too. I know he did. The weird thing is, even now, I can't decide whether it was real, a shared hallucination, or something entirely different. Some nights, when I'm driving home from work and the hills are dark, I'll glance at the ridgeline. I swear, just for a second, I see a faint light flicker there. Not moving, not blinking, just hovering. And in that moment, my stomach twists, the same way it did on that first night watch. I'll never know what it was. No aircraft, no satellites, no training exercise, nothing explains it. But I remember it, the silence, the fog, the way it hovered like it was waiting for someone to notice. Even now, thinking about it makes my skin crawl a little. I don't chase it anymore. I don't watch the ridgeline like I used to, but I never forget. And sometimes, when the night is still, I swear I see it, just for a heartbeat, waiting exactly where it was that night. I was driving back home from visiting my brother in Danbury. It was a little past 11 p.m., and the country roads were empty, wet from an earlier drizzle. My name's Garrett Mason, and I usually drive these roads with the music up, windows cracked, just to hear the tires on the asphalt and the occasional owl. That night, though, the air felt heavier, quiet in a way that made the wet trees almost oppressive. I remember the moment because it started small. The headlights on my car dimmed. Not like when you switch to high beams or the battery's dying, but they dipped slowly, like someone had turned a dial down for a few seconds. The dash stayed lit, the engine sounded normal, the wipers kept their rhythm on the windshield. I blinked, thinking maybe it was the wet road reflecting differently, but it wasn't. I slowed down a bit, eyes scanning the tree lines and the open fields to either side. Then I saw it. A single bright light hovering low over a field off to my left. Not moving side to side, not flickering, just suspended maybe 10 or 15 feet off the ground. It was round, perfect, and unnaturally bright, the kind of white that doesn't really happen at night, even with street lamps or passing cars. I squinted, trying to make it out, thinking maybe it was a barn light, a tractor, some random work light. But there were no buildings there, just crops and darkness, wet from the rain. I slowed to a crawl, gripping the wheel a little tighter, trying to get a better look. My headlights came back to full brightness as I got closer, but the hovering light stayed perfectly illuminated, not blinking, not moving. I thought about pulling over, but the shoulder was muddy and narrow. Instead, I stayed in the lane, creeping past it, heart thumping, expecting it to react, maybe move away. But it didn't. The weirdest part was the silence. Not the absence of sound, just the unnatural quiet that surrounded it. The rain had stopped, the wind had died down, and even the hum of the tires on the wet asphalt seemed muted near that light. I couldn't hear any engines, motors, or fans, nothing that would explain it. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting headlights from another car, a farmer heading home late. Nothing. The road behind me was empty. I looked again at the light through the side window, and my pulse quickened. It felt like it was observing me. Not like a drone scanning the field, but aware, deliberate. The way it stayed hovering just off the ground, the brightness, the silence, it was unnerving. I didn't take my eyes off it as I drove past the field. For a moment I thought I saw a shimmer around it, a heat wave-like distortion, but there wasn't any heat, just that unnaturally perfect white glow. The headlights hit the field, reflected off the wet leaves, and for a split second, I thought I saw shapes, dark and small, moving at the edge of the light. My first thought was deer, but nothing in the pattern made sense. No rustling, no bounding away. I blinked and the shapes were gone. The field was normal again, the crops slick and still, wet from the rain. My pulse slowed a bit, but the tight feeling in my chest lingered. I drove on, glancing over my shoulder constantly, half expecting it to follow or blink out completely. It didn't. When I finally turned onto the main road toward my house, there was nothing in the fields behind me. No light, no movement, no distortion. Just the usual dark stretch of country road and the occasional reflective sign. I tried to convince myself it was a car light, a trick of reflection, a reflection off wet leaves or clouds, But it didn't move like a car. It didn't react to my headlights, and it was stationary when I passed it. The memory of the headlights dimming still makes me uneasy because the car never faltered. The engine sounded normal, the lights returned, and the tires kept their rhythm on the road. But for a few seconds, I had this clear sense that I wasn't entirely alone in the field. The next morning, I told my brother about it over coffee. He laughed, said I was tired, imagined things, probably too much late-night driving. I wanted to ask if he'd ever seen strange lights in that area before, but the look on his face made me hold back. Not skeptical, not scared, just a shrug. Like he'd seen enough weird stuff out here to not care. I went back to the field a few days later during the day. Everything was ordinary. Rows of crops, muddy soil, a few scattered fences. No traces, no impressions in the mud, nothing. I stood in the middle of it for a while, staring up at the open sky, trying to find anything that matched the glow I had seen. Nothing. I haven't gone out that way at night since. I drive faster on the turnoffs now, check the rearview mirror more than I need to. Sometimes, when the sky is clear and the fields are wet, I swear I catch the faintest glow in my peripheral vision, just beyond the tree line. It disappears before I can focus, but my stomach tightens every time. I don't know what it was, and I don't try to rationalize it anymore. It wasn't a drone, it wasn't a plane, not a reflection, and nothing human made it. Just a bright light, hovering low, quiet as the night, with headlights dimming for no reason at all. I tell people the story sometimes, usually to friends who've driven these roads late at night. Most nod, hum politely, and change the subject. A few remember seeing lights too, but none describe it like I did. I get the same feeling when I drive past those fields now, the sense that someone or something is watching, waiting silently. The car runs fine, the road stays empty, and yet my hands tighten on the wheel anyway, and I can't shake the image of that perfect bright orb suspended low over the crops, not moving, just watching. Even now, when the sky is clear after a rain, I glance at the fields as I pass, just in case. And sometimes, for a split second, I swear I see it again. Hovering, silent, white and bright, and the world around it still and quiet, like the night itself has paused for a moment. I'd gone out that night just to get away from everything. My name's Lila, and I usually spend evenings on the back porch with a glass of wine, watching the stars. I live out in the hills near Ridgewood, a place far enough from city lights that the sky looks almost like someone spilled glitter over black velvet. That night was clear, unusually warm for late October, and there wasn't a cloud in sight. I leaned back in my old wooden chair, blanket around my shoulders, binoculars hanging around my neck, just looking up. I'd been tracking some of the brighter constellations, trying to memorize them, when I noticed a point of light that didn't fit. At first, I assumed it was a satellite, moving slowly like the others I occasionally catch. But then it jerked. Not a smooth movement. It darted, almost zigzagging, stopping abruptly like someone slammed the brakes on a tiny invisible car. Then it zipped again in another direction. I frowned, adjusting my binoculars. Nothing else in the sky was moving like that. My eyes darted around trying to catch anything else that could explain it. A plane, a drone, maybe even a shooting star. But this point of light was the only one, moving in ways that felt wrong, almost intelligent. I called my roommate, Mara, who's usually skeptical about anything weird. She came out, bundled in her hoodie, yawning. "What is it?" she asked. I pointed and she blinked. "Looks like a star." She squinted and I saw her frown as it jerked again. "It's not a star," I said quietly. "Stars don't move like that. Watch." We both stayed still, our breath visible in the cool air. It darted sideways, paused midair, then seemed to hover for a few seconds before moving again. The motion wasn't gradual, it was precise, almost deliberate. I rubbed my eyes. Maybe I was imagining it? But Mara hadn't said a word, and she doesn't usually indulge in my star obsessions. After a few minutes, it stopped again. Not just a pause, completely still, like it had landed on some invisible surface. My stomach tightened. I lifted the binoculars and focused on it. There was no glow aside from the pinprick of light, no heat distortion, no flicker of movement around it. Then it darted again, fast this time, across the horizon, almost invisible except for the lingering glow at the edges. I sat down heavily. "Okay, that's not normal," I muttered. Mara just shook her head, looking slightly pale. Then it happened. I glanced away thinking I'd lost it, and when I looked back, it was back where it started. No motion in between, no blur, nothing. Just right there, twinkling like a regular star. I blinked, lowered the binoculars, and stared. My mind was spinning. How does something disappear like that? I felt my chest tighten. It was too fast to be a plane or satellite, too precise to be random. Mara's voice cut through my thoughts. "Lila, it's still there," she said softly. I nodded. "Yeah, I know." We stayed out for another hour, trying to track it, trying to see if it would move again. It didn't. The rest of the sky stayed quiet, stars blinking in their usual positions, a few planes passing far off, nothing unusual. Eventually, we went inside, leaving the porch light off. I kept glancing back through the window, but the star was steady, ordinary. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had missed something, some small cue that would explain it. My mind kept replaying the motion, the jerky, intelligent path, the pauses, the sudden returns. I checked my phone for satellites, flights, anything. Nothing matched. I even looked up drone sightings in the area. Nothing. The next day I tried to rationalize it. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks. Maybe it was a reflection from the porch light off something in the yard. But every time I thought that, I remembered how fast it had moved, the sudden stops, the way it returned exactly to its original position. No reflection does that. Over the next few nights, I went out again, hoping to catch it or see something similar. The sky was clear, the stars steady, nothing out of place. Yet I kept thinking about that one point of light. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the kitchen at night, I glance out the window at the stars, and I swear I see it flicker. Not moving, just a subtle pulse, like it's acknowledging that it's there, watching. I haven't told anyone else about it, not in detail. People would laugh or roll their eyes. Even Mara won't talk about it much. She says she saw it too, but she quickly changes the subject. Maybe we were both tired, seeing things, but I can't convince myself. I go outside sometimes now, looking for that erratic star. I'll stare for hours, tracking satellites and planes, trying to catch it again. I haven't. Yet sometimes, in the middle of a quiet night, I'll swear I see it flash across the sky, impossible, precise, like it never left the first place I saw it. And every time I blink, it's back. I don't know what it was. It wasn't a plane, or a satellite, or a meteor. Nothing I can identify. Just that one point of light moving in a way that shouldn't be possible, then returning like nothing happened. It leaves me unsettled, the kind of unease that sits in your chest, quiet, persistent. I still watch the sky most nights, hoping maybe I'll catch it again. Maybe it'll move in front of me once more and I'll finally understand. But most of the time, it's just the stars, and that one star, impossibly still, waiting, almost teasing me. I climbed onto the roof around midnight, careful not to wake my parents. The night air was cool for late June, carrying that wet smell of the grass after the occasional afternoon rain. My name's Eli Hammond, 16, and this was one of those nights I just felt like getting away from everything. The house, my little brother snoring in his room, the quiet, suffocating hum of suburbia. I had my old blanket rolled up under my arm and a flashlight in my pocket, though I wasn't planning to turn it on. The neighborhood was dead quiet. Usually I'd hear crickets, a dog barking somewhere down Pine Street, tires rolling over asphalt. That night, none of it. I made it to the roof, the shingles warm and rough under my sneakers. I sat down, swung my legs over the edge, and just stared up. The sky was clear, the stars unusually bright. Orion was there, Betelgeuse glowing faintly red, the Milky Way slicing across the blackness. It was perfect for stargazing. I remember seeing it almost immediately. A circular patch of sky that was darker than everything else, a void where no stars existed. I blinked a few times, rubbed my eyes. I assumed it was some cloud catching the moonlight, but the patch was perfectly round. Sharp edges like someone had cut it out with a stencil. And it wasn't moving with the clouds. It was still. I leaned back a little, trying to see if it was just a trick of my eyes. But then it started to glide, slowly, silently, over the house across the street. I froze, gripping the edge of the roof. The patch moved smoothly. No wobble, no flicker, no sound. Not a plane, not a helicopter, not a drone. My stomach tightened, and I had that weird sense you get when you know something's real but can't figure out what it is. I almost called my little brother up to look, but I stopped myself. It was too weird, too quiet. If someone else saw it, they'd freak. I didn't want anyone around. I just sat there, eyes locked on that dark circle moving across the stars. It wasn't fast, not like a shooting star or anything mechanical. It moved like someone dragging a black sheet across the sky. After a minute that felt like hours, it disappeared. Just gone, like someone had erased it. I sat frozen, staring at the same patch of sky that was now filled with stars, perfectly normal. I checked around, half expecting to see something perched on the roof next to me, a shadow of some kind. Nothing. Just the night, quiet, ordinary. I climbed down as carefully as I had climbed up, knees shaking, stomach tight. In my room, I tried to convince myself it was a shadow, a cloud, a trick of the moon. But nothing matched it. I lay in bed, eyes open, listening to the house settle, listening to the normal hum of the refrigerator, the faint tick of my clock. The normality was comforting and terrifying at the same time. Over the next few days, I kept thinking about it. At school, I caught myself staring out the windows at lunch, scanning the sky for that same patch, trying to catch it again. I'd tell myself it was a dream or my imagination, but it felt too real. When I closed my eyes, I could see it. A perfect, dark circle moving silently, untouched by the stars it passed over. I tried to look it up, figure out if anyone else had seen anything like it. I didn't tell anyone at school. My friends would have laughed, called me crazy, said I was looking too much at the stars instead of my phone. The more I tried to rationalize it, the less sense it made. Clouds aren't perfectly circular, planes don't swallow stars without a trace, and nothing that moves silently like that exists in textbooks. I went out a few more nights after that, hoping to see it again. Nothing. The skies were normal. Crickets, a few distant dogs, streetlights glowing softly against the trees. It was like it had only been there for me, just that night, and then vanished completely. I think about it every so often. When I'm lying in bed on a warm night, windows open, the suburb quiet except for the occasional car, I glance up. I wonder if it's still out there, somewhere over the horizon, gliding silently, or if it was a one-time thing, impossible to ever explain. I don't chase it anymore. I don't climb onto the roof at midnight, but the memory is there, like a crease in my vision that I can't smooth out. That circular patch of sky, darker than everything else, moving slowly, silently, and then gone. Nothing explains it, nothing fits. And somehow, even thinking about it makes the world feel a little less ordinary than it did before. I'm not sure what it was, or why I saw it, or if I imagined any of it at all. But it was real enough for me that night. Real enough to make me sit on a roof and just watch the sky, wondering if anyone else in the world had seen it too. I'd been up since before sunrise, trudging through the dense woods behind my uncle's cabin in northern Maine. The smell of damp pine and mud was heavy, and the ground was slick from the rain that had fallen overnight. I'd gone out for a late-season hunt, my rifle slung over my shoulder, compass clipped to my jacket, and a thermos of coffee rattling in my pack. My name's Aaron Wilkes, and I've hunted these woods most of my life. But that morning, something felt off. It started small. The birds weren't singing. Normally, by 8 o'clock, you've got the chipper chatter of finches and sparrows filling the air, even this late in October, but there was nothing. Only the quiet scrape of my boots on wet leaves and the distant drip of water off pine needles. I shook it off. Quiet woods aren't unusual. Sometimes animals just go silent for a stretch. I checked my compass, making sure I was heading north toward a ridge I wanted to reach before noon. The needle wobbled at first, normal, but then it spun in a complete circle, over and over, before settling briefly, then spinning again. I stopped dead, staring at it. The compass had always been rock solid for me, even out here where magnetic anomalies from old iron deposits can sometimes mess with readings. This wasn't that. It wasn't subtle. It was frantic, like it had a mind of its own. I put it down and tried to steady myself, telling myself it must be water on the dial or a defect. But as I looked around, I noticed something else. The fog. Not the thin morning mist I was used to, but a low, rolling layer that hadn't been there when I started hiking. It curled through the trunks and tangled around branches like it had grown overnight. The light was off too. Overcast, gray, but almost artificial in the way it diffused through the fog. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a deer, reflected in the half-light of the fog. pale white shape about the size of a small elk moving slowly between the trees, but the closer it got, the less defined it became. It wasn't a solid animal. It pulsed, faintly as if it was breathing light. Not a harsh glow, just a soft, white shimmer that thickened and thinned in an almost hypnotic rhythm. I froze. My rifle hung at my side, useless. I didn't want to disturb it. I swear I could hear a faint hum, low and deep, like air moving through a long tunnel, but the woods were silent otherwise. No wind, no bird calls, nothing. My stomach twisted, but curiosity rooted me there. The shape hovered between two massive pines about 50 feet away and then just faded. Not like it ran off or moved out of sight. It simply blinked out like someone had cut the lights. I blinked and it was gone. The fog seemed to shrink back, leaving the woods looking normal again, except for the compass lying on the ground. I picked it up carefully, and the needle had stopped spinning. It pointed north like nothing had happened. My pulse was still racing, and for a long moment I just stared at the dial, trying to rationalize everything. I started walking again, keeping a careful eye on the trees, my ears straining for any sound, anything that could explain it. Every shadow seemed too dark, every flicker of light too deliberate. I tried humming to myself to break the tension, but it didn't help. I felt watched. I felt small. About 10 minutes later, I heard a snap behind me. A branch underfoot, nothing else. I froze. My heart thumping, I raised my rifle, scanning the dense woods. The snap came again, closer this time. But when I swung around, nothing was there. No animal, no human, nothing. Only the fog curling lazily between the trees. I realized I was disoriented, though my compass had settled. Something about the woods felt altered. The moss and leaves looked the same, but somehow wrong. Like I'd walked into a space that was familiar and yet completely not. I told myself I was being paranoid. I'm a hunter. I know the woods, but the feeling didn't leave. Eventually, I reached the ridge. Sunlight was starting to pierce through the clouds in streaks, painting patches of the forest floor gold. I stopped, knelt, and tried to catch my breath. The hum had disappeared entirely, and the woods felt normal again. The compass lay steady in my hand, and the pulsing light was nowhere to be seen. On the way back to the cabin, everything seemed ordinary at first. Birds were chirping again. The wind rustled through the pines like usual, and the wet leaves squelched under my boots. But a part of me stayed on edge, glancing at shadows and tree trunks, expecting something to emerge. Nothing did. I kept my rifle close, though it felt silly now. When I finally stepped onto the cabin's porch, I set the compass down and looked back into the forest. The fog had dissipated entirely, the sun catching on dew in a way that made everything look normal, almost picturesque. I called out to my uncle, who was inside making coffee, but I didn't tell him what happened. I couldn't. I wasn't sure I'd even be believed. I spent the rest of the day trying to shake the memory of that pulsing glow, the spinning compass, the dead silence. I went over it again and again, looking for a mundane explanation. Electrical interference? Gas from the soil? Reflection off morning mist? Nothing fit. Even now, weeks later, I find myself thinking about it. Walking through the woods at night, I check my compass more than usual. I notice the fog differently. I watch the spaces between trees a little longer, and every so often I swear I see a faint white shimmer in the corner of my eye. And for a heartbeat, the world holds still. I can't explain it. I don't even try anymore. All I know is that morning in the heart of the Maine woods, something appeared that shouldn't have, and it left me questioning everything I thought I understood about the forest and maybe about the world. I was driving the old white van down County Road 17, the kind of stretch that twists between fields and woods and barely qualifies as a road in some spots. It was one of those humid, early summer evenings where the air feels thick and the smell of freshly turned soil hangs heavy. My name's Tom Hargrove, and I deliver supplies for a small grocery chain, mostly rural orders, people who don't drive into town often. I'd been on the road since 6 in the morning, and by 9 at night, I was bone tired. My last stop was supposed to be this farmhouse on the edge of a wheat field. I'd delivered here a few times before. The place is isolated, down a gravel driveway that twists through a patch of trees, ending at a house with a big wraparound porch. I pulled up and killed the engine. Immediately, I noticed something weird. All the outdoor lights, porch, yard lamps, even a small lamp hanging near the garage, were flickering like a soft strobe, all in unison. I frowned and stepped out, thinking maybe a wiring issue. The whole place was old. Anything electrical could be wonky. I set the boxes down, watching the flicker. It wasn't the normal inconsistent flicker of bad bulbs. This was synchronized, rhythmic, almost deliberate. I glanced up, just instinctively, and that's when I saw it. A pale glow hovering above the tree line, drifting slowly, almost lazily, moving against the slight breeze. It wasn't bright like a spotlight, more like a dim, uniform haze of light. I froze, trying to make sense of it. As I blinked, the lights on the house snapped steady again, as if the flicker had never happened. My first thought was that I'd imagined it, that the light was just a reflection off clouds or moisture in the air. But the feeling in my gut told me otherwise. Something about it felt deliberate, like it was aware I was there. I shook my head and started setting the boxes on the porch. Every instinct told me to leave, but part of me was stubborn. Professional stubborn, I guess. While I worked, I kept stealing glances at the glow. It drifted a little closer, then hovered in place, then drifted again, slow and quiet. No sound at all. The night was still except for the chirp of crickets and the hum of cicadas. I dropped a box near the door and looked up again. The glow had shifted slightly, closer to the tree line bordering the back field. I squinted, trying to see any shape or outline, but it was just a pale haze. My mind was racing. Helicopter? Drone? But there was no noise, not even a low hum like a motor. I even stepped into the light of the porch lamp, hoping my eyes would adjust, but it didn't change. I grabbed the next box and noticed the shadows in the yard seemed wrong. Normally the porch light casts long shadows, but now they stretched in odd directions, faintly, inconsistently, almost like the light itself was bending around something. I froze, holding the box mid-step. The glow seemed to drift slightly to my right. I squinted again. Then the house lights flickered once more, very briefly before settling, and the glow above was gone. Just gone. I scanned the sky. Stars, moon, nothing unusual. The air felt thicker now, heavier, like someone had taken a deep breath and held it. My hands started shaking. I could feel the hair on my arms standing on end. I put down the last box on the porch and rang the doorbell. Mr. and Mrs. Lawson came out, both looking confused at my presence. I asked casually if they'd noticed anything strange outside tonight, any flickering lights or weird sky stuff. They looked at me like I was crazy. Lights? We didn't see a thing, Mr. Lawson said. Everything's normal. Mrs. Lawson nodded. I didn't press. I got back in the van, still looking around, still expecting to see the glow drifting back. Nothing. I drove slowly down the gravel road, trying to shake the feeling of eyes on me, like something was lingering just at the edge of the tree line. The van felt heavier, and the hum of the engine sounded wrong, deeper, somehow distorted. About half a mile down the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The farmhouse was quiet, dark. The glow was nowhere in sight. My mind kept going over what I'd seen, trying to rationalize it. A reflection, an odd electrical fault, fatigue, anything. Nothing fit. Nothing made sense. On the way back to the main highway, I kept glancing at the tree lines, expecting to see movement or light, but there was nothing. The night was normal, quiet, except for the hum of the van and the occasional distant hoot of an owl. I didn't mention it at work. People would have laughed or shrugged it off, and I wasn't in the mood for explanations that didn't exist. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the glow had been aware of me, had watched me set down those boxes, a presence that was deliberate and detached, like a silent observer. A week later, I drove past the same farmhouse during the day. Everything looked ordinary, sun shining, the fields golden with wheat, no flickering lights, no drifting glow. I even slowed down to check the yard, the porch, the tree line. Nothing. Absolutely normal. I've driven that road dozens of times since, mostly at night, and I haven't seen anything like it again. But sometimes, when I'm tired and driving alone, I swear I feel a weight in the air, a presence just past the tree line. Not hostile, just watching. I don't know what it was, and I don't try to. I just know that for a few minutes that night, something completely ordinary, the farmhouse, the gravel road, the quiet summer air, wasn't ordinary at all. I parked at the depot that night, unloading my route, hands still a little shaky. I told myself I'd get over it. I'd explain it later, maybe chalk it up to fatigue. But even now, sometimes I'll close my eyes and see that pale glow drifting slowly above the trees, synchronized with the flicker of every outdoor light, aware and calm, vanishing before anyone else could see it. I had arrived at the cabin late Friday afternoon, carrying a duffel bag and a small cooler. The road up from the highway was nothing but gravel, winding through dense pine and birch, and by the time I pulled into the small clearing, the sun was dipping low, turning the sky a muddy orange. My name's Claire Monroe, and I'd rented this lakeside cabin to get away from the city for a week, to write, think, and just be alone for a while. The cabin itself was small but cozy, perched just a few yards from the water's edge. I spent the first hour unpacking, lighting the wood stove, and staring out the window at the lake. The water was calm, glassy, reflecting the early evening sky perfectly. Everything felt normal, peaceful. That night, after dinner, I decided to take a short walk along the shore. The moon was rising, low over the tree line, silver light spilling across the water. It was quiet, no insects buzzing, no distant calls from the woods, just the gentle lapping of water against the rocks. I stopped halfway down the dock, peering at my reflection in the lake when I noticed a ripple. A broad, slow ripple, like something heavy had slid just beneath the surface. I froze, thinking maybe a fish, though nothing this large should have been here at this time of year. The water settled again, the reflection of the moon returning to smooth silver. I squinted, scanning the lake. Nothing moved. No wake, no splash, nothing. I shook my head and laughed quietly to myself, thinking I'd been spooked by shadows or the wind shifting under the trees. I walked back to the cabin, but when I glanced out the window later, I noticed the surface again. The moonlight struck the lake at just the right angle, and I could see faint ripples creeping outward, as though something large had submerged in the middle of the lake. But when I turned on the flashlight and aimed it at the same spot, there was nothing, just moonlight, dark water, and the faint reflection of stars. I tried to focus on my writing, forcing myself to ignore it. I told myself I was tired, maybe imagining movement. I worked for a while at the small desk by the window, scribbling in my notebook, when I caught a faint glimmer beneath the water, something that wasn't there before, a soft white glow, shifting slowly as though it were pulsing beneath the surface. My stomach tightened. I leaned closer to the glass, eyes wide, trying to make sense of it. I couldn't see a shape, just the faint, steady light under the water. I set the notebook down and stepped outside, cold air brushing my face, the dock creaking under my weight. The glow seemed to retreat slightly as I approached, moving just beyond the reach of the moonlight. I raised my flashlight again, sweeping over the water. Nothing. Just black, mirrored surface, as though the lake had swallowed the glow entirely. The feeling hit me then. Unease, but not panic. It wasn't malicious, not like some predator, but it was aware. There was a presence. I stayed at the edge of the dock, frozen, watching. The ripples returned, gentle, almost lazy, spreading across the water, but still no splash, no disturbance beyond the surface. My mind raced. Fish don't glow. Otters don't make the water shimmer like this. And the lake wasn't deep enough for anything that size to be hiding undisturbed. I considered calling someone, anyone, but for what? Hello? Yes, I'm at a cabin, and there's a glowing thing under the water. I laughed quietly at myself. Ridiculous. I couldn't explain it, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. I stayed out there for maybe 20 minutes, watching as the glow pulsed faintly, rising and sinking slowly, and then it vanished. Just gone, leaving nothing but ripples fading into glassy calm. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and checked the water from different angles. The lake was perfectly still, reflecting the moon as though nothing had happened. I went back inside, sat at the window, and watched the lake from there. The quiet was total now, almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional whisper of wind through the trees. I couldn't see the glow anymore. I tried to convince myself it had been bioluminescent algae, though I knew that didn't bloom like that in late October, and certainly not with a pulse, not moving like it had. I spent the rest of the night awake, listening. The cabin creaked, the fire popped, and every so often I'd glance at the lake, half expecting to see the glow return. But nothing. The next morning, I went out early, skimming stones across the still water. Everything appeared normal in the daylight. No glow, no ripples, nothing. The lake was calm, like a regular lake, the way it should be. I tried to explain it to myself over coffee on the porch. Reflection, fatigue, imagination. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that soft light pulsing beneath the surface, drifting slowly in the shadows of the lake bed. I didn't see it again during my stay. I swam in the afternoon, fished along the shore, and took long hikes into the surrounding woods. Nothing unusual occurred, and yet when I'd look at the lake, I felt a weight like something unseen was watching just below the surface. I left the cabin after a week, packing my things quietly, the lake calm and silent behind me. On the drive back down the gravel road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a shimmer trailing me in the tree line or a reflection in the water I'd just left. There was nothing. Back in the city, I told no one about it. Not really. People would laugh or chalk it up to cabin nerves or tired eyes, but sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I see that faint, steady glow. I see it under the moonlight, drifting slowly beneath the surface, and I remember the way the lake went utterly silent as it hovered, pulsing beneath the water, aware of me, though I could never find it again. I don't know what it was, and I don't try to. I just know what I saw. And some nights I swear I can still feel it watching from under the water, waiting, silent and steady, in a lake that should be perfectly ordinary. I was walking up to the silo that night, my boots crunching over the frost-hardened dirt, when I noticed it. The air was cold, just below freezing, and the sky was clear, full of stars, with the thin crescent of the moon hanging low over the northern field. My name's Hank Morrison, and I've been farming this land for most of my life. Corn, a few head of cattle, nothing fancy. But that night, everything felt off. I had gone out to check on the silo. The auger had been acting up, making this clattering sound that I couldn't ignore. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out, thinking it was just another mechanical issue I'd have to fix. As I got closer, though, I saw it. A faint orange glow hovering above the fields, low over the northern corn. At first, I thought maybe it was a fire, but there was no smoke, no heat haze, nothing. It just floated, stationary, as if suspended in the air. I stopped dead, gripping my flashlight a little tighter, my heart ticking faster than it should for just a light. The glow wasn't bright, more like a dim ember, pulsing softly, almost rhythmically. I called out, thinking maybe one of the farmhands had a lantern or some equipment out there, but the only response was the crunch of my boots on the frozen ground. I took a few cautious steps toward the edge of the field, where the glow was strongest. Every instinct in me was screaming to turn around, but I couldn't stop myself. I fumbled in my coat pocket for my binoculars. My fingers were stiff from the cold, and I had to pause several times to get them out without dropping them. When I finally raised them, the glow was gone. Nothing. The field was empty, pale moonlight washing over the corn, the silence heavy and still, the kind of silence that presses in on you from all sides. I blinked and lowered the binoculars, scanning the horizon. Not a single moving light, nothing out of place. My first thought was that I'd imagined it, maybe the reflection of the moon on ice crystals or fog drifting just above the ground, but my stomach told me otherwise. That glow had a shape, a presence, a rhythm. It hadn't been random. I stepped closer to the silo, flashlight cutting a thin line through the darkness. The metal walls reflected the beam, and I could hear the faint hum of the auger inside. I forced myself to check it, to convince myself that I was just seeing things. Everything inside looked normal. The machinery silent now, not a sound besides the distant wind rustling the last of the corn stalks at the edge of the field. I stepped outside again, just to be sure. The glow hadn't returned, but there was a pressure in the air, something that made my skin crawl. I swear the wind carried a low vibration, like the field itself was holding its breath. I felt watched, even though I knew I was alone. I called out again, louder this time, my voice cracking in the cold night. Nothing answered. I walked a few steps back toward the farmhouse, keeping my flashlight sweeping over the field. That's when I noticed the shadows. They weren't normal. The moon cast long, thin shadows from the corn and the silo, but in the direction where the glow had been, the shadows shifted strangely, like they were bending around something invisible. I froze, letting the beam of light wash over the area. Nothing moved, nothing changed, but the feeling was unmistakable. Something had been there, and maybe still was. I turned and headed back to the house faster now, my flashlight bouncing in the frost-crusted ground. My dog, Duke, had been inside, but now he came running out, barking. I bent down to grab him, feeling his fur tense under my hand, and that's when I heard it, a low, vibrating hum, distant, almost imperceptible at first. It didn't last long, maybe 2 seconds, and then nothing. The wind picked up again, rustling the corn, and the world felt normal, like I had just imagined it all. I locked the doors and sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window at the northern field. I kept expecting the glow to return, but it didn't. I poured myself a cup of coffee, hands still shaking slightly, and tried to focus on the mundane, the creak of the old floorboards, the tick of the wall clock, the steam rising from the mug. Everything was ordinary again, except for the echo of that presence. Sleep didn't come easy. Every sound outside, the wind through the trees, the distant cry of an owl, even the faint hum of the refrigerator felt magnified, like the night had been listening while I worked. I kept waking, imagining that orange glow hovering at the edge of the field, just beyond the reach of my vision. The next morning, I went out early to check the field. Frost covered the ground, the corn stalks stiff, and everything looked normal. I walked the northern edge slowly, scanning for footprints or signs of anything unusual. There was nothing. No tracks, no scorch marks, no disturbances. Just the field, quiet and empty under the pale winter sun. I tried talking to my neighbor Pete about it, but he just laughed it off. Orange glow? Probably just a reflection from the barn light or the moon, he said. I didn't argue. I know what I saw, what I felt, but explaining it was impossible. He didn't see it. No one else did. Since that night, I've checked the field many times, usually from the porch, sometimes with binoculars, sometimes just with my eyes. I haven't seen the glow again. Sometimes I think I hear the faint hum, but it's never there when I look. The air feels heavier on certain nights, though, a quiet weight pressing down across the northern field. I've gone about my work, tending the crops, feeding the animals, fixing machinery, all the while carrying that memory. It wasn't a fire, it wasn't lights in a neighboring town, and it certainly wasn't anything I can explain. All I know is that night, something hovered above the fields, something deliberate and quiet, and by the time I tried to see it properly, it was gone, leaving only the stillness, the heavy silence, and a farmer who knows his land better than most and still couldn't account for what he'd seen. I just passed the playground, the one with the rusted swing set and the concrete path curling around the pond when I noticed it. Or maybe I didn't notice it at first. I just felt it, like the air itself had grown heavier, tighter around my chest. My name's Laura Kinney. I usually run the same loop every night through Eastwood Park, and I've never been a fan of the dark or fog, but it had been a long day and I needed to clear my head. The fog that night was thick, rolling in from the north end of the park, curling around the oak trees like it had a mind of its own. I slowed my pace, trying not to let my imagination run wild. That's when I saw the shadows. Not like normal shadows cast from the streetlights that flickered along the trail, but darker, denser, moving in the periphery of my vision. Every time I turned my head, trying to catch them, they were gone. I stopped and stood in the middle of the path, chest heaving from the run, but also from something else. There was a faint rustling, like leaves brushing together, but I couldn't tell if it was the wind or something else. My flashlight app on my phone was dead. I'd forgotten to charge it, so I was running blind except for the pale halo of light around the street lamps. I told myself I was imagining it, that my brain was just tired. I'd been working late and my mind was probably playing tricks. I started jogging again, slower this time, trying to keep my eyes focused straight ahead. But I could feel it, the prickling at the back of my neck, the weight of something just out of view following. Every turn I made, every time I looped around a tree or a patch of brush, it felt like the space behind me stretched and shifted, as if someone or something was keeping pace without ever making a sound. I passed the pond, and that's when it got worse. The fog hung low over the water, blurring the reflections of the lampposts. My shadow stretched on the path, but I could swear there was another shadow, detached from mine, gliding across the edge of the water. I stopped, heart hammering. There was nothing there when I looked directly, just the empty pond and the mist curling off the surface. But when I turned back, straightened my gaze to the path again, I caught a flicker at the edge of my vision. A dark figure ducking behind a tree, or maybe just a trick of the fog. I tried to shake it off and started walking, slower, my sneakers crunching on wet leaves. The park is small, and I should have been close to the northern exit by then, but it felt like I was going in circles. Every time I thought I recognized a section of path, it didn't look quite right. Branches where there hadn't been branches, puddles where the ground had been dry. My sense of direction was slipping, even though I've run this loop hundreds of times. Then I heard it. A low, barely there sound, like soft scraping, like someone dragging their fingertips across bark. I froze, listening. The sound stopped immediately. My breath was loud in my ears. I turned slowly, scanning the fog-shrouded trees. Nothing. The park was silent. I convinced myself it had been a branch rubbing in the wind, but my stomach didn't buy it. I started jogging again, faster this time. I couldn't tell if I was being followed or if I'd just been spooked into paranoia. My hands were cold. My heart was racing. And then the shadows returned, tiny, flickering at the corner of my vision, darting between trees. I caught a glimpse once, maybe a second, and it looked off. Not human, not entirely. Too thin, too elongated, like the silhouette of a person stretched wrong. But when I turned to look, of course, nothing was there. I reached the northern edge of the park, where the path meets the street. The fog thinned slightly, and the familiar glow of the street lamps greeted me. Relief surged, but so did confusion. The sense of being watched didn't leave, even under the yellow light. I looked back toward the park, into the swirling gray, and the shadows seemed gone. But the air felt heavier, like a weight had lifted but hadn't disappeared. I kept running, moving faster now, until I reached my apartment. I locked the door behind me, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. That happens sometimes, I told myself. Late-night runs, fog, overworked brain. But I couldn't shake the feeling. Even standing in my apartment, lights on, windows closed, I felt it pressing against the edges of perception, as if it had followed me all the way in, but stayed just out of sight. Over the next few days, I tried going back to the park. During the day, everything was normal. Children playing, joggers running, dogs barking. Nothing seemed out of place. But I avoided running at night. I couldn't bring myself to see it again, not with the fog and the trees and that feeling that I wasn't alone. Sometimes, though, when I close my eyes at night, I see it again. The flicker at the corner of vision, the elongated shapes that vanish the moment I look directly. I hear that faint scraping sound in my head like fingernails on bark, and every time I wonder if I'll ever understand it. Or if it's still out there, watching, waiting, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I've never told anyone this before, not friends, not family. They'd laugh, say I was imagining things, that fog and exhaustion make the mind play tricks. Maybe they're right, but I know what I saw or felt, and I can't explain it. Every time I walk past that park during the day, the hairs on my arms raise, and I feel that same weight at my back. Something's there. I just can't see it. And maybe that's exactly what it wants. I never thought a backyard bonfire could make you question reality, but that's exactly what happened last summer. My name's Paula Kent, and I live with my husband Tom and our 12-year-old son Eli on the outskirts of Brattleboro, Vermont. We've got a modest patch of woods behind the house, enough for a fire pit and some chairs, a little garden, and the kind of privacy that makes nights feel genuinely quiet. It was early July, around 9:30. The sky was still a soft blue, streaked with clouds that had held on to the heat of the day. Tom had built the fire while Eli and I set out blankets and marshmallows. The air had that sticky warmth left over from the afternoon, the sort of humidity that clings to your skin, and there was the occasional chirp of crickets just beginning to wake up for the evening. We lit the fire, and the smell of smoke and pine filled the yard. Tom was talking about his week at work. Eli was poking at the flames with a stick, and I was just leaning back, letting the day's stress drift off. The fire crackled, sparks flying up, and everything seemed completely normal. Until I noticed the sparks. At first, I didn't think anything of it. Sparks shoot up all the time, little flickers of light in the night. But then I saw one that didn't drop. It hung just above the fire, motionless. My eyes darted around, thinking it might be a trick of the wind or my vision. Then another, and another. All the sparks rising as usual, then stopping midair, hovering just above the fire like tiny frozen stars. I blinked and the air seemed to grow heavier. Tom noticed too. "What the hell?" he said, his voice low, uncertain. Eli had stopped poking the fire entirely, his wide eyes glued to the sparks. They weren't moving up or down, swaying with the breeze, nothing. Just suspended. I tried to speak, to ask Tom if he was seeing it too, but my words stuck in my throat. The usual crackle of the fire seemed distant, muted, almost swallowed up. For a second, I couldn't even hear the crickets. I could only see those tiny suspended sparks, and it felt like the night itself had paused. Then it happened. The sparks didn't fall or drift. They vanished, all at once. The glow that had been hovering flickered and disappeared in a single, seamless instant. The silence afterward was absolute. Not quiet in the sense of no wind or distant traffic, but a pressure, like all sound had been held back for a heartbeat and then released. My ears felt full, my heart thudding in a way that made my chest ache. I looked at Tom, and his jaw was tight. "Did you see that?" he whispered. Eli didn't answer. He just stared, a little pale, still gripping his stick. I told myself it had to be a trick of the light, some strange reflection, maybe a shadow on the clouds, something explainable. But the sparks had been right there, close enough that I could see the texture of each tiny ember. They couldn't just vanish like that. We sat in silence for a few minutes, staring at the pit. The fire had returned to its normal flicker and glow. The night had its usual hum back. The crickets chirped again. I even laughed a little, nervously, trying to push the unease away. Tom did too, but it felt forced, like we were both aware of something that hadn't left. I tried to continue the night normally. Eli roasted a marshmallow, we talked about school and work, but every time I glanced at the flames, I half expected to see sparks hanging there again. None did, but the memory of them frozen midair stayed. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, or that the world had paused for just long enough to let me notice it. Later inside, I kept checking the windows, peering out at the tree line behind our yard. Nothing. No movement, no lights, no signs. But the hairs on my arms kept rising, the way they do when you're aware of something unseen. The next night, I went out to the fire pit again, alone, just to see if anything repeated. Nothing. Just the fire, the smoke, and the familiar night sounds. I stayed for a while, listening, staring, willing myself to believe I'd imagined it, but the feeling remained. The quiet, the hovering sparks, they weren't gone from my mind. Weeks passed, and life went back to normal, or as normal as it gets in a house at the edge of the woods. Eli tells the story sometimes, but he shrugs it off like a dream you can't quite hold on to. Tom hasn't mentioned it since either. I didn't want to make him think I'd lost it. Still, when I pass the fire pit at night now, or when I see sparks rising from a candle or a fireplace, I pause. I watch them for just a second longer than usual, half expecting them to freeze, half expecting that same impossible silence to press in again. And I feel the echo of that night, the way the ordinary became something otherworldly, even if just for a heartbeat. I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was a trick of the eyes, some atmospheric anomaly, or something else entirely, but I remember it, every detail. The sparks, frozen, the silence afterward. The sense that time had tilted just slightly, and the world had held its breath. Even now, the memory is sharp. I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night thinking I hear that hush again, that unnatural pause, like the air itself is waiting to reveal something beyond sight. And I wonder if one day I'll see it again, or if it was something that only needed to be seen once. I'd been hiking the Rimrock Trail in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains for a while before the sun started dipping behind the peaks. My name's Colin Hayes, I'm 28, live in Santa Fe, and I've done enough solo hikes to know when the woods feel off. That evening was one of those times, though I didn't know it yet. I left the parking lot around 4 in the afternoon, carrying a light pack, water, some snacks, a flashlight just in case. The weather had been clear all day, a few clouds drifting lazily, and the temperature was dropping as the sun sank. By the time I reached a small clearing about halfway up the trail, the light had this orange-gold hue, and the air smelled like pine and damp soil. I stopped for a break, set my pack down, and pulled out a granola bar. That's when I noticed it. A shadow, perfectly circular, hanging maybe 30 feet above the clearing. It wasn't attached to a tree or anything on the ground. I thought it might be a trick of the light, a patch of clouds or mist, but the shape was distinct, almost solid, dark against the lighter sky behind it. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and the shadow stayed. My heart started to pick up a little. Not a panic, just that uneasy thrum you get when something is subtly wrong. I whispered to myself, probably just a bird or a cloud. I mean, that's what I told myself to sound rational. I took a few steps closer, my boots crunching on the leaf litter. The shadow didn't move toward me or away. It stayed there, hovering over the center of the clearing. I crouched, squinting, trying to catch movement, some flicker of life, anything that made sense. Nothing. It didn't shift with the wind, didn't change shape. I pulled my phone out, thinking I'd snap a picture, but the screen flickered strangely. For a second, it didn't turn on at all, like the battery died in an instant, and then it worked again. I stared at it for longer than I should have. Phones don't just glitch like that normally, and the timing felt too coincidental. I stepped even closer, almost to the edge of the clearing, and the shadow disappeared. Just like that. No whoosh, no blur, nothing. One moment it was there, suspended above the ground. The next, it was gone, leaving only the empty clearing and the scent of pine and dirt. I froze. The air felt heavier, quieter somehow. Birds weren't chirping. Not a squirrel rustled. The usual hum of insects at this time of evening was completely gone. I realized I hadn't heard anything for maybe 30 seconds, and the silence felt deliberate, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I backed up a little, telling myself I'd imagined it. Maybe it was some weird cloud, a trick of the angle of the sun, my tired brain, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow had been real, that it had been there intentionally. I kept hiking, moving more cautiously now. The trail narrowed, and the shadows of the trees stretched long across the path. I thought I saw something at the edge of my vision, a flicker of movement, maybe a deer, maybe not. But every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. About 15 minutes later, I reached a rocky overlook with a view of the valley below. I stopped to catch my breath, and that's when I noticed the stars. It was earlier than I expected, but the first few had appeared in the deepening sky. I leaned against a boulder and just stared, trying to shake off the earlier strangeness. That's when I saw it again, or maybe something similar. A faint, circular shape, low in the sky above the opposite ridge. It wasn't glowing, just a slightly darker patch against the dusk. It hovered for a few seconds and then, just like the first time, it vanished. No sound, no wind, no trace left behind. My chest tightened. I tried rationalizing, maybe a hot air balloon far off, some optical illusion, something explainable. But the perfect circular shape, the way it just disappeared, this didn't feel like anything ordinary. I checked my watch. I'd been hiking for nearly 4 hours, but it felt like 10. Time seemed off. I shrugged it off, blaming exhaustion and the sun lowering in the sky. I decided to head back down. The trail was steep and narrow in parts, and I wanted to reach the parking lot before it got dark. The silence of the woods followed me, though. The usual evening sounds, the rustle of small animals, the wind through the pines, were subdued. I could hear my own boots on the trail, the occasional scuff of loose rocks, but nothing else. Halfway down, I thought I saw a shape moving at the edge of the trees. I stopped, heart thumping, and stared. A shadowy figure, but just out of focus, like my brain was filling in the details. When I turned completely to look, there was nothing. My stomach knotted. I kept walking, faster now, refusing to look back. By the time I reached the lower clearing, it was dark. My flashlight beam cut through the blackness, bouncing off the low brush and twisted pines. I could see my car, headlights off, parked exactly where I left it. I sat inside for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, trying to process what had happened. My thoughts kept going back to that first circular shadow, hovering above the clearing, perfectly still and then gone. The second one on the ridge had only confirmed it wasn't my imagination. Driving back to Santa Fe, the road's empty, I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting what exactly? Something following me? Nothing appeared. Just me, the road, and the dark mountains flanking either side. I got home and told myself I'd sleep it off. But I kept thinking about the way the forest went quiet, the way the shadows moved just beyond my vision, and the circular patches that appeared and vanished without a trace. I can't explain it. I've hiked those trails dozens of times before and after, and nothing like that has happened. I still think about it sometimes, late at night. The woods felt alive in a way I can't describe, like they were aware I was there, observing. Maybe it was something natural, some strange play of light and shadows. Maybe it wasn't. All I know is that for a moment, in that clearing and above that ridge, something was there, and then it wasn't, and the forest went back to its usual rhythm as if nothing had ever happened. I was finishing up my shift at the Desert Mirage gas station just outside of Dry Creek, Nevada. It was one of those nights where the air is so still it almost hums. Hot, dry wind had died down, and the desert stretched out in all directions like a black canvas. My name's Tony Rivas, and I've worked the night shift here for about 2 years. Usually it's boring. Cars trickle in every now and then, mostly locals or travelers heading through. But this night was different. I was stacking some soda bottles behind the counter when I noticed the headlights. At first, I thought it was a car coming down Highway 95. Easy mistake. The highway runs past the gas station, a ribbon of asphalt that cuts through miles of desert, and headlights are common, especially around 10 or 11 p.m. But when I looked closer, something didn't add up. There was a row of lights reflecting off the ridge about half a mile out. Straight ahead, over the hill, no cars should have been visible yet. I could see the reflection of headlights, 4, maybe 5, but the road was empty. Not just empty in the sense of no cars, but literally empty. I stepped outside, the air dry against my skin, the smell of asphalt and gasoline sharp in my nose. Lights. The lights stayed there, hovering over the hill, not moving. I rubbed my eyes. Maybe my brain was tired, overworked from the night shift. It happens. Desert mirages are a thing. I stepped closer to the edge of the lot, squinting, trying to make sense of the shapes. The lights weren't moving. They just sat there, glowing, reflecting off the sandy surface of the hill. I went back inside to grab my binoculars. By the time I returned, the lights hadn't changed. I looked at them, focusing, trying to see a car, a truck, anything that could explain it. Nothing. The lights faded slowly, almost like someone was dimming a switch, but without the object actually moving. I watched for a good 5 minutes, unable to tear my eyes away. The highway remained empty. I'm not someone who jumps to strange explanations. I've worked in the desert my whole life. I know the tricks light can play in heat and dust. But this wasn't a heat shimmer, not exactly. The lights didn't waver, didn't blur. They just sat there, solid. The more I stared, the heavier the air felt, like the desert itself was pressing down on me. I tried calling my coworker, Luis, who usually closes with me, but his phone went straight to voicemail. Not that it mattered. He lives in town, 20 minutes away. I couldn't exactly run up the hill to see what was reflecting the lights, not with the uneven terrain and the loose sand. So I stayed put, watching. That's when the first odd sound hit me. A low hum, almost mechanical but soft, not vibrating the ground, more like it was pressed against my ears. I stopped breathing. The hum didn't get louder or softer. It was steady. My heart was thumping in my chest, but I told myself to calm down. Cars make weird sounds over hills. The desert plays tricks, I said to myself. But my instincts told me otherwise. I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. Something darker than the night itself, sliding along the edge of the ridge. I turned fully, focusing, but there was nothing there. The lights hadn't changed, just sitting on the hill, glowing faintly, reflecting off the sand in a perfect line. My skin prickled. I went back inside, slammed the door, and leaned against the counter, trying to calm myself. I kept glancing through the front window. The lights were still there, slowly dimming. I started checking the cameras, most of the parking lot, the pumps. But the cameras didn't reach the highway over the hill. I was alone in my loop of observation. I grabbed a notebook and started jotting things down. The lights had been there about 20 minutes at this point, fading, slowly, no movement. My mind kept returning to the same impossible thought. There was nothing on the road, yet the lights reflected perfectly as if someone were driving. Then the wind picked up slightly. A fine layer of sand swirled across the asphalt, brushing against my legs through the cracks in the door. The reflection finally faded entirely. The hum disappeared at the same time. The desert went back to silence, the stillness stretching out for miles. The only thing that moved was the occasional tumbleweed rolling across the lot. I kept checking the highway, waiting, hoping to see a car, a truck, anything that could make sense. Nothing. It was like the lights had never been there. My chest felt tight, and I realized I hadn't moved for almost half an hour. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the tension. I cleaned the counter mechanically, telling myself it had been a trick of reflection, a mirage from some distant passing car, something explainable. I finished the night without another incident. Driving home, the desert stretched endlessly on either side of me, dark and silent. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights trailing me. Nothing. Just the empty road, the same still night. At home, I told myself I'd forget it by morning. I even laughed quietly, trying to brush it off as fatigue. But I didn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that row of lights, hovering, perfectly aligned, fading slowly. I could almost feel that weight in the air, the hum pressed against my ears. The next day, I drove back past the station. The hill looked normal, featureless, no shadows, no reflections, nothing. The highway was empty, quiet. Friends asked if I'd been spooked, and I shrugged, said maybe. But I know what I saw, or at least what I felt. I don't know what it was. I've been back on night shift since then, but I haven't gone outside after dark near that hill. Something about it, that stretch of desert, feels wrong. I can't explain it. The lights never moved, never blinked, just existed for a while, and then vanished. And I keep thinking about that hum, steady, faint, as if the desert itself had been alive for a moment and then gone back to sleep. Every time I drive past, I glance at the hill, half expecting to see the same reflection hovering again. It hasn't appeared, but I can't shake the feeling that it's still there, just out of sight, waiting. I was walking home from my night shift at the grocery store, around 11:30, through the quiet streets of my neighborhood in Glenwood, New Jersey. My name's Mark Leland, 32, and I live alone in a small townhouse on Cedar Avenue. The streets were almost completely empty, the occasional car passing in the distance, and a soft chill in the air from an early autumn night. I had earbuds in, music low, just enough to take the edge off the long shift. The streetlights cast long, thin shadows across the pavement. Everything looked normal at first. Houses dark, a few porch lights on, the familiar buzz of distant traffic. I was halfway down the block when I noticed something weird. Every porch light on my street flickered at the same time. I stopped mid-step, pulling out one earbud. They all blinked off, then on, in perfect unison, like some sort of synchronized signal. My first thought was a power surge or maybe maintenance work, but the street felt too quiet, too still for that. There wasn't a single car in sight, no hum of a transformer flipping, nothing. I shrugged, thinking maybe I was overreacting. It was probably just one of those electrical quirks houses get in older neighborhoods. I kept walking, but the image of all those lights flicking at once kept in my mind. As I passed the corner where Maple intersects Cedar, I noticed something else. Above the rooftops on the far side of the street, there was a dim, slow-moving glow. At first, I thought it was just a reflection from a streetlight or someone leaving a lamp on in an upstairs window. But it didn't behave like that. It moved horizontally, almost gliding, much too slow and smooth for a drone or a passing plane. I stopped and squinted, trying to make sense of it. The glow was faint, pale yellow, almost like a candle flame stretched out. When I blinked, literally closed my eyes for a second and opened them, it was gone. Just gone, like someone had flipped a switch. I stared for a long time, hoping it would come back, but the rooftops were dark again, only the occasional light from a street lamp breaking up the night. I shook my head, muttering, "Okay, weird." I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an airplane reflecting city lights, maybe a low-flying helicopter, but the smoothness, the slowness, and the disappearance didn't fit. I started walking again, but the street felt heavier, like the quiet was more pronounced. My footsteps sounded louder on the asphalt than usual, and every rustle of leaves in the wind felt amplified. I passed the Jenkins house and noticed their cat sitting in the window, staring directly at me. ears perked. Usually it's lazy at this hour, and the way it was focused felt wrong. Like it wasn't just a cat watching me, it was reacting to something else, something I wasn't seeing. A few minutes later, I heard a soft humming. Not mechanical like a car or an air conditioner, more like a low-frequency buzz that didn't seem to have a source. I stopped, looked around, but the street was empty. No cars, no people, just the faint hum lingering for a few seconds before fading away. I started walking faster. My phone was in my pocket, but I hesitated to pull it out, not because I was scared exactly, but because the first instinct was to see something in the glow of the screen, and I didn't want to risk missing it if it appeared again. When I reached the top of Cedar Avenue, I noticed it again, that same pale glow, hovering low over the rooftops in the distance. It was moving slowly, almost lazily, a few houses down, and then it blinked out just as I reached the intersection. I stopped dead, my heart starting to beat a little faster. Okay, I said to myself, more firmly this time. Just lights, probably. But the rational voice in my head was weak. Everything about the movement, the way it appeared and disappeared, and the flickering porch lights earlier didn't add up. I kept my pace up, not wanting to linger on the street. By the time I got to my own house, I was gripping the keys in my hand, unlocked the door, and went inside. I double-checked the locks and the lights, and then sat down in the living room. My phone buzzed, some notifications from work, but I didn't check them right away. I was still staring out the window, half expecting the glow to reappear over the rooftops. It didn't. I tried to sleep that night, but every creak in the house sounded amplified. My mind kept going back to the lights flickering in perfect unison and that slow, hovering glow. The next morning, everything seemed normal. Streetlights were working fine, houses looked exactly as they should, and no one mentioned anything unusual. I told a coworker about it at the store that evening, and he laughed, said I was probably seeing things after a long night shift. Maybe he's right. But I can't explain the timing, the synchronization of the porch lights, or the way that glow moved and vanished. I still walk that route sometimes, late at night, and I'm always looking up now, half expecting the same slow, drifting light to appear above the rooftops. So far, nothing, but every so often I swear I catch a faint flicker out of the corner of my eye, and the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I woke to the sound of a faint humming, low and steady, the kind that vibrates in your chest more than it does in your ears. It wasn't like the usual rustle of leaves or the wind brushing through the pines. It had a metallic edge to it, almost mechanical. I was deep in the Pine Ridge National Forest, just east of Gatlinburg, Tennessee. My name's Jeremy Klein, I'm 28, and I had set up camp off a side trail I've hiked before, far enough from the main sites that you only hear the occasional owl or a distant stream. I glanced at my watch. 2:14 a.m., dark but not pitch black. The moon was a thin crescent, and the faint stars barely cut through the tree canopy. My tent, a small two-person model, seemed suddenly too small, too flimsy, the walls trembling slightly with every gust of wind. I wasn't sure if the hum was outside or somehow inside the tent itself. I waited a few seconds, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a generator from some other camper farther down the trail. But there was no road close enough for vehicles, and this was the middle of a weeknight. I hadn't seen anyone else setting up camp. My stomach nodded a little. I unzipped the flap slowly, trying not to make a sound, peered out. The forest was still. No lights, no movement, not even the reflective gleam of eyes in the brush. I half expected the hum to get louder once I unzipped, but it stopped completely the instant the flap opened. Just silence. The kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every sound your own body makes, the faint rustle of your backpack, the zipper sliding back, your own breathing. I crouched and looked around with my flashlight. The beam caught the rough bark of the trees, the outline of fallen branches, the mossy ground. Nothing. I moved the light slowly in a circle, trying to pierce the darkness beyond my immediate clearing. Still nothing. I stepped out, barefoot, trying to make my movements quiet. The humming didn't return. My mind was starting to play tricks on me. I knew that, but the sensation of being watched was real. I felt it behind me, pressing from the shadows, but when I spun around, there was only the forest. I went back into the tent and sat down, telling myself I was imagining things. Maybe it had been some weird combination of wind through a fallen branch and the way the canvas of the tent amplified the sound. I tried to focus on my breathing, on the sound of the stream 100 meters away, on anything that grounded me. Then I heard it again. Faint, like before, but this time I could tell it was moving, slow, almost crawling along the perimeter of my campsite. Not rustling leaves, not cracking twigs. The pitch and timber were unmistakably mechanical. I froze. My mind went blank, and then a knot formed in my chest. I knew I should stay in the tent, but something made me want to see it, to know if it was real. I unzipped the tent again, careful, holding the flashlight low. The forest was empty. The hum had stopped. My heart raced. I scanned the tree line in every direction. Shadows moved, maybe, but only as shadows of branches swaying in the breeze. No glow, no figure, no light. I went back inside the tent, zipped it up, and sat in the dark. I told myself to sleep, to pretend it never happened, but the feeling lingered. I tried counting in my head, focusing on simple math problems, anything to take my mind off the noise, but it crept back into my awareness. The vibration in my chest, the sense of something just beyond the trees, something that wasn't there when I looked. Around 3 a.m., I thought I heard something else. A soft tap, like metal against stone. Not close, maybe 50 feet out. I didn't move. I couldn't. My flashlight was still off. My phone was in airplane mode to conserve battery. I didn't want to see it if it was there. The tapping stopped. I didn't hear the hum again. The night settled into normal forest sounds. Distant water, wind brushing against leaves, an owl hooting. I lay awake, eyes wide, staring at the tent ceiling, feeling the fabric brush against my forehead as my pulse hammered in my temples. Morning came, slow and gray, mist rolling through the pines. I unzipped the flap and looked around again. Nothing had moved. No footprints, no broken branches, no marks in the undergrowth. It was as if the forest had absorbed the night's tension and erased every trace of it. I packed up, careful not to rush, and started the hike back to my car. My legs felt heavy, my senses still sharp, waiting for some sign of the night's events. The trail was quiet, but not unnaturally so. Birds were starting to chirp, and the wind carried the scent of damp earth. I stopped a few times, half expecting a shadow to flicker at the edge of my vision, a hum to creep in from behind the trees, but nothing happened. I made it back to the parking lot around 10 a.m., the asphalt hot under the sun, and the hum of passing cars and distant engines sounded normal, grounded, reassuring. Even now, days later, I can't explain what I heard. I don't know if it was a machine, an animal, or something else entirely. I keep thinking about the timing, the way it started and stopped exactly when I moved or unzipped the tent. I keep wondering if I really saw shadows moving or if it was my mind trying to make sense of the sound. I haven't camped there again, and I don't plan to, but sometimes at night when the wind shifts just right, I swear I can feel that same hum in my chest. Not loud, just enough to make me pause, to make me wonder what was really out there. The evening was quieter than usual, the kind of silence that makes you notice every small ripple in the water. My name's Claire Reynolds, and I decided to take the kayak out on Lake Wapiti just as the sun started sinking behind the trees. I live close by in a small cabin my parents left me, and I've been paddling this lake since I was a kid. I thought I knew every curve, every shallow spot, every patch of reeds, but that night, something made it feel unfamiliar. The sky was painted a deep orange, fading into violet, the last light hitting the trees like they were on fire. I launched the kayak from the little dock near my cabin and pushed off slowly, letting the paddle drip water and carry me toward the middle of the lake. The water was calm, almost mirror-like. Fish jumped here and there, a loon called once, and then nothing. Just that soft lapping of water against the hull of my kayak. I had been paddling maybe 10 minutes when I noticed it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the fading light, a reflection or a shadow of a small fish. But it was too big, too consistent. Just under the surface, a faint shimmering light glided alongside me, keeping pace with my strokes. It wasn't like sunlight reflecting off fish scales. It moved smoothly, deliberately, almost like it was aware of me. I slowed, trying to see it better, and the light mirrored my motion, that drifting closer with every stroke. I stopped paddling completely, and immediately, the light vanished. The lake returned to normal. My heart picked up, a little confused, a little thrilled, but mostly uneasy. I told myself it was probably some bioluminescent algae or a reflection from something on the shore, but it didn't make sense. The light had followed me through open water, not near the shore, not near any overhanging branches. I started paddling again, cautiously, and the light reappeared, tracing the underside of the water like it was attached to me somehow. I tried to slow down, paddle faster, spin the kayak in a circle. It kept pace perfectly, gliding beneath the surface. I could see it shimmering, almost like a faint, pulsing glow, pale white with hints of green. It didn't make waves, didn't stir the water. It just moved. I glanced toward the cabin, thinking maybe I could cut across to the dock faster, end the night early. But the lake had taken on a different feel. The trees at the far end looked darker, the shoreline somehow farther away. I told myself I was being paranoid. Dusk has a way of playing tricks with depth perception. Still, every instinct in me was tense, alert. I felt like I wasn't alone, even though I was out there by myself. After a few minutes, I tried a little experiment. I drifted without paddling, letting the kayak float with the current. Nothing happened. No shimmering light, no movement beneath the water. Then, as soon as I started paddling again, it returned. It glided alongside me again, perfectly timed with my strokes, keeping its distance, but always there. I couldn't see a source, a shape, or a reflection above the water, just the faint glow moving beneath the surface. I slowed down again, letting my paddle barely touch the water. The light hovered, almost hesitant, following me without any noticeable pattern except to mirror my motion. I tried to whistle, call out to it, even bang the paddle on the kayak, nothing. The light didn't respond, didn't change course, didn't make a sound. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, I stopped paddling for a moment and the glow disappeared again. The water was ordinary, dark, reflecting the last sliver of sunset. I decided I couldn't stay out there much longer. I paddled toward the dock, keeping my eyes on the water, half expecting the light to pop back up. But it didn't. The lake was still, ordinary again. I tied the kayak up and sat on the edge of the dock, just staring at the surface, feeling the unease linger. I thought about calling someone to tell them, but it sounded ridiculous. Hey, a glowing thing followed me across the lake. I didn't. When I got back inside the cabin, I kept glancing at the lake through the windows. Nothing appeared. I kept imagining the shimmer in my peripheral vision, the way it had glided, silent and smooth. It hadn't felt threatening. Not exactly. But the way it mirrored me, the way it disappeared when I paused, made me feel like I'd glimpsed something aware, something not quite part of the natural world I knew. I spent the rest of the evening making tea, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. The shadows in the cabin seemed heavier than usual, and the wind rattled the old window panes in a pattern that almost matched the pulse I'd seen beneath the water. I tried to sleep, but I kept replaying the kayak moving across the lake, the light gliding beneath the surface, perfectly silent, following me. The next morning, I returned to the lake at first light, thinking maybe I'd catch another glimpse or figure out what it was. Nothing. Just the normal reflections of the rising sun, the same reeds, the same ripples where fish broke the surface. I even paddled the same path, repeating every movement from the night before. Still, no light, no shimmer, nothing unusual. I haven't been back out after dusk since then. I still kayak during the day, but something about that evening sticks with me. I can't explain it. The way it followed me, the way it vanished when I stopped, the sheer precision of its movement. It didn't make sense. I keep checking the water when I go near the lake, half expecting it to appear again, but it hasn't. I tell myself I was lucky to see it, or unlucky, depending on how you look at it. Whatever it wasn't threatening, but it was deliberate. And knowing that something could be there, moving perfectly beneath the water, unseen and silent, makes the lake feel different now, like it's hiding more than I understand. I'd been driving for hours through the stretch of canyon between Moab and Monticello, Utah. It was late past midnight, and the desert had a kind of empty stillness that made every sound, my tires on the asphalt, the engine humming, even my own breathing, feel amplified. My name's Scott Harper. I've been hauling freight for over a decade, mostly cross-country, and I've driven this route 100 times. I thought I knew every turn, every shadow along the cliffs, every faint glint off the rock faces. It was a clear night, maybe 10 degrees cooler than usual for August. The moon was waning, but bright enough that I didn't need my high beams for much of the canyon road. I was halfway through a long haul from Denver to Albuquerque, hauling refrigerated produce. The truck's cabin was quiet, just the AC and the low hum of the engine. I had the CB off. Nobody was on this part of the route. I remember passing the first tight curve near the red cliffs when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was just the reflection of my own headlights bouncing off the rock wall, but it was too distinct, too defined. I slowed a little, squinting, and realized there was a surface hovering maybe 30 feet off the ground, pressed close to the canyon wall. It wasn't moving at all, just floating. It reflected the moonlight perfectly, like polished metal or glass, and I could see the jagged lines of the cliffs mirrored in it. I blinked and adjusted my rearview mirror, thinking my tired eyes were messing with me. When I looked straight ahead, it was still there, frozen, perfectly aligned with the curve of the canyon. My heart rate went up a little. Nothing freaks a driver out like something you can't identify in the dead of night on a road like this. I kept my hands on the wheel and my foot steady on the gas, telling myself it was probably a reflective sign or some old piece of construction equipment left dangling somehow. I drove past it, careful not to swerve. My headlights passed under it, and I got a better look. No wires, no supports, nothing holding it up. It just hovered, reflecting the cliffs, perfectly still. I glanced to my right as I rounded the corner, expecting it to disappear behind the rocks. But it was still there. For a moment, I felt like I could reach out and touch it if the truck were smaller. Then, as I checked the mirror a few seconds later, it was gone. Completely gone. No reflection, no shadow, no trace. My stomach tightened. I told myself I must have misjudged the angles. Maybe it was a reflective patch on the cliff that only looked like it was hovering from that one point. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized the reflection had been too perfect, too precise, like a sheet of mirrored glass pressed against the rock. I tried to focus on the road, shaking off the unease, but I couldn't. The canyon felt different somehow, quieter, almost expectant. I kept checking the mirrors, scanning the cliffs for anything else out of place, and noticed the shadows seemed sharper, longer than they should have been in the moonlight. There were shapes, maybe just rocks, that seemed slightly off when I glanced at them peripherally, almost like they were moving when I wasn't looking directly. About 20 minutes later, I reached a wider part of the canyon where the road straightened, and I stopped at a small pull-off to stretch my legs. I killed the engine, and the quiet hit me. Total silence except for the faint whisper of wind through the rocks. I scanned the canyon walls with my flashlight. Nothing. No floating surfaces, no reflections, nothing out of the ordinary. I stayed there for a few minutes, breathing, telling myself I was just tired, my mind playing tricks after hours of monotonous driving. I started the truck again, lights low, and continued on. But even as I drove, I kept noticing tiny things. Small, sharp reflections glinting in the moonlight on rocks that should have been matte. I thought I caught movement, but whenever I turned my head, nothing was there. A faint, low hum tickled my ears for a moment, but it faded when I tried to focus on it. I made it to the next town about an hour later. The hum and reflections were gone, the cliffs flat and silent. I parked at a truck stop and walked around, trying to convince myself it had been a trick of the canyon walls or my imagination. A couple of other drivers were there, filling tanks and eating coffee, and nothing they said or did made me feel any less isolated. Nobody else had seen anything. I kept thinking about that hovering surface for the rest of the drive. How it had been there, perfectly still, reflecting the cliffs, and then disappeared without a trace. I ran the route again a week later, same stretch, same time of night. Nothing. Not a glimmer. The cliffs looked ordinary, the road empty, the moonlight casting normal shadows. Even now, weeks later, I can't stop replaying it in my mind. Sometimes I think I imagined it entirely, a product of fatigue and monotony. But I remember the reflection, the way the surface mirrored the cliff face so exactly, the way it stayed there as I drove past, and how it vanished completely when I looked back. It wasn't a plane, it wasn't a sign, it wasn't a truck. I don't talk about it much. Most people would just laugh it off. But when I drive through that canyon at night, even under the bright light of the full moon, I can't help scanning the cliffs, waiting for that same perfect reflection to show up. And sometimes when the road is empty and quiet, I swear I feel that same weight of stillness pressing in from the canyon walls, like whatever it was might still be waiting, just out of view. I was sitting in the backyard, wrapped in my old wool blanket, staring up at the sky. It was one of those crisp early spring nights in Vermont, cold enough to see my breath, but clear, with that kind of dark where the stars really stand out. I've always liked to stargaze ever since I was a kid. My name's Marcus Flynn, and I live alone on the edge of town, so there's hardly any light pollution. Most nights, it's just me, the crickets, and the occasional hoot of an owl. That night, I decided to grab the telescope and see what I could spot. I set it up near the back porch, adjusting the tripod until it didn't wobble. At first, it was just the usual stuff. Jupiter, low on the horizon, a scattering of satellites blinking slowly as they traced arcs across the sky. I kept scanning, switching between naked eye stargazing and the telescope when I noticed something odd. At first, I thought it was a plane, but the lights weren't moving like any plane I'd ever seen. There was a small cluster of them, maybe 5 or 6, moving together, but not in a straight line. They zigzagged subtly like they were avoiding imaginary obstacles, and sometimes one of the lights would pause mid-path, hovering in place for a second before darting again. I frowned, thinking maybe I was imagining it. Satellites don't move like that, and I knew planes didn't make sudden shifts in direction without any sound. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes again, the lights had shifted slightly, closer together now, moving in a tighter formation. That caught me off guard. I pinched my eyes shut, rubbed them, then opened them again. The lights had changed position again, this time slightly higher in the sky. I tried not to panic. Maybe it was a trick of perspective, I told myself. But I knew enough about the night sky to be suspicious. I've spent hours mapping stars and tracking satellites with the telescope. These movements didn't match any pattern I'd ever seen. I leveled the telescope on the cluster, focusing on one of the lights, trying to see if it was reflecting anything, if it had a tail, a wing, anything. But all I could see was a pinpoint of light, pulsating very slightly, like it had a subtle rhythm. I blinked again, just once, and the whole cluster shifted. Not randomly either. It seemed deliberate, as though they had reacted to my eyes. I couldn't tell if that was possible, but that's exactly how it felt. I tried holding my gaze steady, staring without moving my eyes, and for a few seconds the lights stayed put. Then, slowly, they started drifting again, still moving in those odd arcs, pausing occasionally, then surging forward as if they had momentum, but no real propulsion I could identify. I leaned back against the porch railing, rubbing my temples. My hands were trembling slightly. I kept expecting a drone or some kind of remote-controlled device to reveal itself, but there was nothing. No sound, no movement closer to the ground. The backyard was still, the grass lightly frosted from the cold, the trees standing motionless against the night. I tried to focus on the pattern. At first it seemed chaotic, but then I noticed a symmetry. When one light paused, another would shift slightly, almost compensating. They weren't random, there was coordination. I thought about recording it on my phone, but even through the small screen, the lights didn't look like anything familiar. I put the phone down, thinking it might be better to just observe with my eyes. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. I'm not sure. Time started feeling weird. The stars were constant, but the lights kept moving, slowly, shifting when I looked away and jumping forward when I blinked. I'd blinked several times in a row, focusing on a single star beyond them, and when I looked back, the cluster had split into 2 smaller groups, mirroring each other perfectly, like something out of a kaleidoscope. I shook my head, trying to steady my thoughts. Maybe it was some atmospheric effect, something reflecting faint city lights far away. But there were no clouds, no haze, nothing to bend or distort light that I could see. It was too precise, too deliberate. I even called out, "Hello?" just to break the tension, and heard nothing back except the normal night sounds. A distant bark, the wind shifting in the trees, my own breath loud in my ears. No response, no hum, nothing to indicate machinery. Then I noticed the movements started to slow. They weren't zigzagging as sharply, just hovering in place with slight pulsations. I focused on the biggest light in the cluster. It seemed brighter now, almost like it was getting closer. But when I tilted my head, it maintained the same apparent distance against the stars. My stomach started twisting. I couldn't explain how something could shift position relative to me, change configuration, and yet stay the same size in the sky. I stood up, walked closer to the edge of the yard, hoping for a better perspective. The lights continued to adjust, shifting slightly to keep me in view, or at least that's what it felt like. I blinked, and suddenly they were aligned in a straight line, moving slowly toward the horizon. I ran inside quickly, thinking maybe stepping out of my line of sight would make them leave. I checked the back window, half expecting them to disappear completely, but they were still there, faint and shimmering, moving against the stars in a pattern I could no longer describe. I felt an odd mixture of fear and fascination. Whatever they weren't conventional. They weren't satellites, planes, drones, birds, or reflections. They were something else entirely. Eventually, I forced myself to leave the backyard, stepping into the house, locking the door, and sitting on the couch. I kept glancing at the windows. For hours, I thought I saw movement beyond the glass, like the lights were still tracking me, still dancing against the stars. Every time I blinked, every time I moved, the pattern seemed to shift. Sleep came fitfully. I woke up at least twice, convinced I could see the faint glow of the lights through the blinds, but by dawn, the sky was pale and the cluster was gone. The night left behind a strange silence, a tension I couldn't shake. I went outside as soon as the sun rose. Nothing. Just an ordinary yard, ordinary trees, ordinary sky. The telescope revealed nothing unusual. I keep thinking about that night. I keep scanning the skies, waiting for the lights to return, but they haven't. And even if I try to rationalize it, temperature inversion, reflection, satellites, or something human-made, I can't fully explain it. They weren't random. They weren't natural, at least not in any way I understand. They reacted. They moved. They shifted. I don't know if I'll ever see them again, but I know what I saw, and I know how it felt. That night in the backyard, with the stars overhead and the lights moving against them, something else was out there, something that didn't belong to the patterns I know, something alive, aware, or at least deliberate. And every time I close my eyes, I see that movement again, shifting and blinking, just beyond comprehension. I'd been driving back from visiting my brother in Kansas City. It was late, probably close to midnight, and I'd already been on the road for 6 hours. I was too tired to keep going, so I pulled into a rest area off I-70 just outside Columbia. Nothing special, just one of those small lots with a bathroom building and a few vending machines, half the lights buzzing, the kind of place that never feels entirely safe, but is good enough when you're too exhausted to care. I parked near the far end of the lot, locked the doors, reclined the seat, and tried to sleep. There were maybe 3 other vehicles there, one semi-idling closer to the entrance, and 2 cars scattered apart, no one close to me. I remember checking my phone before I dozed off. It was 12:19 a.m. I don't know how long I slept, but I woke up to sound. My radio was on, filling the car with low static. I never leave it on when I shut the engine off, and I definitely didn't turn it on before sleeping. The dial light was glowing faint blue, the speakers whispering that hiss of empty air. For a few seconds, I thought maybe I'd hit the button in my sleep, but I hadn't shifted position. I was still slouched with the seat back. The thing that made me sit up was how loud the static felt. It wasn't blasting volume, it was actually quiet, but it felt like it was taking up all the space in the car, like it was in the air itself, not just the speakers. I reached to shut it off, but before I touched the knob, I saw something through the glass. Above the windshield, faint lights were moving. They weren't headlights from the lot or reflections. They were up in the sky, just visible against the dark, pale, white and bluish glows circling each other slowly, like 3 or 4 fireflies caught in orbit. They didn't blink or strobe, just drifted in a looping pattern right over where I sat. I froze. My hand hovered over the radio, which kept whispering static. The lights moved in a way I couldn't compare to anything, too smooth, too deliberate. Airplanes don't do that. Helicopters make noise, drones buzz. These were silent, completely silent. I cracked the window a couple inches, thinking maybe I'd hear something, but there was only the faint hum of the semi's engine down the lot. The air was still. The lights kept circling. Sometimes they'd pull farther apart, then close together again, like some slow-motion dance. They didn't drift away. They stayed directly above the car, tracing those loops as if they were aware I was there. My chest felt tight. I wanted to start the engine and leave, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Every instinct said that turning the key, making noise, might draw their attention more. So I sat there gripping the wheel, staring upward. After a while, the static changed. It pulsed, not loud, but a soft rhythm, almost like someone was turning the volume knob up and down in slow waves. With each swell, I thought I felt it in my teeth. That was the moment I ducked down. I slid lower in the seat, away from the windshield, as if hiding would do anything. From that angle, I couldn't see the lights directly, just the faint glow passing across the sealing fabric of the car. The static kept its slow, rolling pattern. I don't know how long I stayed like that. My phone was in the cup holder, but I didn't touch it. The idea of a sudden light from the screen felt dangerous. Eventually, I noticed the glow shift. It moved farther away, spreading out, drifting toward the tree line behind the rest stop. The static thinned out, softened, until it was just the usual quiet hiss. Then it cut completely. The radio clicked back into silence like it had shut itself off. I sat up slowly and looked out. The stars were normal. The sky was empty. I didn't sleep again. I started the car, pulled out of the lot, and drove the next 2 hours to St. Louis, even though my eyes burned and my head pounded. By the time I reached the city, the whole thing felt impossible. But the radio had definitely been off when I parked, and those lights, I can't make sense of how they moved. That's all I know. It happened, then it was over, and I never saw anything else on the road that night. I was hiking solo in the Smokies last fall, early October, right when the leaves had just started to change. I'd set out late in the afternoon from a small trailhead near Cosby and figured I'd make it about 7 miles in, camp for the night, and loop back the next day. I'd done this route a couple times before, so I wasn't worried about being out there alone. By the time the sun dropped behind the ridgeline, I had my tent set up in a little clearing not far from a creek. It wasn't an official campsite, but it was flat, and I'd spotted a fire ring that made me think others had stayed there before. I got my pack off, boiled some noodles, and just sat there eating while the woods started to come alive with night sounds. Crickets, tree frogs, the occasional rustle of leaves from something small moving around. I remember feeling relaxed, almost lulled by the constant buzz of insects. When you spend enough time in the woods, that background noise becomes comforting. It's like a sign everything's normal. I was lying back against my pack, watching the stars start to show through gaps in the trees when it all stopped. Not faded, not shifted, stopped. Every sound cut out in the same instant. Crickets, frogs, even the creek seemed muffled. At first, I thought maybe a predator had moved through. Sometimes owls or coyotes can silence the woods for a while, but I didn't hear anything like that. It was just absolute quiet, the kind that presses on your ears. I sat up, scanning the tree line, and that's when I noticed the stars. Or rather, the lack of them. Directly above me, where the sky had been full of points of light a minute earlier, there was a section that was just blank. Not clouded over. There weren't any clouds that night. It was a clean, sharp shape cutting out part of the sky, huge and dark. I thought maybe it was my eyes adjusting, like when you stare too long and lose focus. But then it moved, slowly, steadily, sliding across the sky. I couldn't make out edges, not really. It wasn't lit up, didn't have any kind of blinking lights like a plane, and it didn't make a single sound. But it was big enough that it blocked a section of the stars as wide as my outstretched hand. I sat there frozen, neck craned back, trying to get a sense of how high it was. That was the strangest part. I couldn't tell. It could have been 100 feet up or 1,000. There was no perspective, no detail, just this absence of stars sliding overhead. The longer I watched, the more I realized it wasn't perfectly black. There was a faint distortion along the edges, almost like heat rising off asphalt. If I looked too hard, my eyes started to water. I grabbed my flashlight without thinking and clicked it on, pointing the beam up. The light didn't reach far, maybe caught a bit of haze in the air, but nothing reflected back. Still, right when I did it, I swear the shape slowed, not stopped, but slowed down, like it had noticed. My stomach dropped. I turned the flashlight off immediately and sat there in the dark, barely breathing. The silence around me felt thick, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. It drifted overhead for what felt like forever, but was probably less than a minute. Then, just as gradually as it had arrived, the blank patch of sky thinned out, and the stars came back into view one by one. The noise of the forest didn't return right away, though. It was another 5 minutes, maybe more, before a single cricket started chirping again, then another, until everything slowly returned to normal. I didn't move until that happened. When the night sounds finally came back, it was almost overwhelming. I remember exhaling like I'd been holding my breath the whole time. I thought about packing up and hiking out right then, but it was pitch black and the trail was rocky. I ended up crawling into my tent and zipping it all the way up, even though it was warm out. I kept the flashlight in my hand and lay there listening to every twig snap and leaf rustle, convinced it was circling back. I didn't sleep much. Every time I dozed off, I'd jerk awake, sure the silence was going to drop again. But nothing else happened. In the morning, the woods were perfectly normal. Birds were loud, the creek was running steady, and there wasn't a cloud in the sky. I packed up, stuck to my loop, and got out of there by noon. I didn't tell anyone about it until a couple weeks later. Even now, I'm not sure how to explain it. All I know is that when the woods go that quiet all at once, it's not something you forget. I woke up to a light. That was the first thing I remember. Not a sound, not movement, but this faint, steady glow bleeding through the nylon walls of my tent. It was pale, almost white, with the slightest hint of blue, and it didn't pulse like a flashlight or flicker like a fire. It was just there, even and soft, bright enough to make me squint while lying in my sleeping bag. I wasn't supposed to be seeing any light. I was camped alone, miles off a logging road in northern Vermont, on the edge of a small clearing near a stream. I had hiked in during the day, pitched camp before sunset, cooked dinner on my little stove, and gone to bed early. No one else was out there. I hadn't even seen another car at the trailhead. At first I thought maybe the moon had broken through the clouds. It had been overcast when I'd gone to bed, but the glow didn't feel like moonlight. It was too focused, too direct. My tent was lit up evenly on all sides, like something was hovering just above me. I lay there holding my breath, waiting for it to fade. It didn't. The glow just kept on, steady and strange. I finally sat up, unzipped the top of my sleeping bag, and listened. Nothing. No voices, no footsteps. The usual night sounds, the stream nearby, the faint buzz of insects, were gone too. The silence hit me like a weight. I reached for my watch and saw it was just after 2 in the morning. My phone was off to save battery, but I didn't touch it. I just sat there, staring at the walls of the tent, trying to convince myself I wasn't seeing what I was seeing. Eventually, curiosity got the better of fear. I leaned forward and unzipped the flap a few inches. The light outside was so strong compared to the darkness inside that I had to blink to adjust. When I pulled the flap open wider, the glow shifted. Not abruptly, not like someone switched it off, but like it drew itself upward. The clearing outside was washed in that same pale blue light, as if the grass and trees had been dipped in frost. Shadows stretched in every direction, sharp and unnatural, like the source was directly above. I tilted my head back and saw it. No shape, no edges, just the glow itself. It was concentrated above my tent, low enough that I felt like I could almost reach it with a tall stick. Then, as I stared, it started pulling upward, shrinking as though someone was reeling it in on a line. The higher it went, the dimmer it became, until it was just a faint smudge against the clouds. A second later, it was gone completely, swallowed by the overcast sky. The darkness that rushed in after was almost worse. My eyes strained to readjust. The clearing looked the way it had when I'd set up camp. Black trees, silver-gray grass in the starlight, nothing moving. The normal sounds hadn't returned yet. It was just me sitting there, the flap half open, waiting. I don't know how long I sat like that. Could have been a minute, could have been 10. Eventually, I zipped the flap shut, lay back in my bag, and forced myself to keep breathing steady. I thought about packing up right then and hiking out, but the idea of walking miles through pitch-black woods after what I'd just seen felt worse. Somewhere around 4, I must have drifted into a light sleep. When I woke again, it was morning. The clouds had cleared and the sun was hitting the tops of the trees. Everything looked ordinary, except for one thing. In the grass just outside my tent, the dew had been disturbed. Not trampled exactly, but pressed down in a perfect circle, about 10 feet across. The blades bent outward, radiating from the center, as though something had hovered close enough to push them flat. I stood there staring at it with my coffee in hand, steam rising into the cool morning air, and I couldn't think of a single explanation that fit. There had been no wind, no animals that big, no people, just me, and that light. I broke camp not long after, packed everything as quickly as I could, slung my pack over my shoulders, and left the clearing behind. But I can still picture that glow, the way it slid upward when I looked at it, like it had been caught in the act. I was flying freight that night, a routine run from Kansas City to Denver. I'd done the route more times than I could count. No passengers, just me, a load of boxes, and a quiet cockpit. It was late, close to midnight, when I leveled off around 30,000 feet. Clear skies, steady air. Nights like that were the easiest, the kind you settle into with coffee in one hand and your checklists in the other. About an hour into the flight, I noticed something off my right side. At first glance, it looked like another plane flying a parallel course. Not unusual, really. You see other traffic all the time, but this one seemed a little too close for comfort. Maybe a mile out, maybe less, holding steady like we were choreographed. The strobes and navigation lights had that same rhythm you'd expect on any aircraft. Red and green, white flash every few seconds. I glanced down at the scope, fully expecting to see a transponder squawk. Nothing. Just my own return and some distant traffic 10 or 15 miles away. I tapped the glass, adjusted the brightness. Still nothing. I called it into center. Kansas City Center, this is Cargo 79er. Do you have any traffic 12 o'clock, 1 mile, same altitude? There was a pause, then the controller came back with, negative 79er. Closest traffic is at your 10 o'clock, 12 miles, climbing through 27. I pressed my lips together and looked back out. The other plane, or whatever it was still there. Same altitude, right where my eyes said it should be. It wasn't weaving, wasn't drifting closer or farther, just hanging there like it had business flying wingtip with me. I thought maybe it was a military bird running dark, but the lights didn't fit. Too bright, too clean. Civilian pattern, not tactical. I tried to convince myself maybe my scope was acting up. Avionics can get finicky sometimes, though I'd never had one fail like that before. I kept stealing glances at it while running through my checklists. Every time I looked, it was still there. Same distance. Same lights pulsing. After 10 minutes of that, the unease set in deeper. The longer it stayed, the more I couldn't shake the feeling it was deliberate. Then it changed. I looked once, and instead of the shape of a plane, there were only 3 lights. They'd separated, hanging in a loose triangle. The form of a fuselage was gone, like it had melted away. I blinked hard and checked again, thinking maybe my eyes were playing tricks. No, 3 distinct lights, floating too steady to be stars, too bright to be anything distant. They held there a moment, then began drifting apart. Not fast, but purposeful, like they were peeling away in 3 different directions. One climbed, angling up and fading higher than I could track. Another slipped forward ahead of me until it bled into the haze of the horizon. The third slid back, dropping behind my wing until it was swallowed by the night. I sat there frozen, staring into the dark where they'd been. My heart was pounding, palms slick against the yoke. I checked the scope again. Still nothing. The radio hissed with the same calm voices, controllers handling flights that had no idea what I'd just seen. I thought about calling it in again, but stopped. What was I supposed to say? That I'd seen a plane that turned into lights? I could already hear the silence that would follow. Pilots talk, controllers talk. Word gets around, you don't want to be the guy with the ghost stories. For the rest of that leg, I kept searching the windows, expecting the lights to come back, but they never did. The sky was empty and ordinary, just me and the hum of the engines. By the time I landed in Denver, the whole thing felt like a dream I'd woken up from too early. But it hadn't been. I'd written down the times on my knee pad, just like I always do. The mark is still there, 12:47 a.m., a note with no explanation. And I can still see it when I close my eyes, that second plane holding perfect formation, then dissolving into three lights that slipped away as if they had someplace else to be. I was on the porch because the house felt too still inside. It had been one of those long days at the clinic. Back-to-back appointments, charts to fill out, the kind of small nagging errors that make you check a patient's name twice. I left my bag by the door, poured a glass of something iced and weak, and settled into the swing with a blanket over my knees. It was late May, warm enough that the nights hung soft, but cool enough that you wanted a little something over your legs. The porch light cast that familiar yellow pool over the steps. The rest of the yard dissolved into hedges and the big maple that leans toward the fence. At first, nothing was odd. The neighborhood was whispering. Somewhere a TV murmured through an open window, a distant car passed, a dog barked twice, and then went on with its night. The little radio on the kitchen counter had been set to low earlier, and its tinny voice floated out the back window for a bit, then faded as people turned off screens. I watch the sky because I do. It's a small ritual, a way to tell the day it's over. The moon was a sliver, and the first stars were pricking out like points on black velvet. I had Rosie, our old beagle, curled at my feet, nose tucked. She stirred sometimes and then settled. That's when the first small thing happened. The crickets that had been making a steady undercurrent of sound cut off. Not a fade out, more like someone snapped a hand over the band. One moment they were there, the next the yard felt like a room with the TV paused. I noticed it the way you notice when the refrigerator stops humming. It's such a minor absence it makes the whole house feel less certain. Rosie lifted her head and looked up at the maple, ears up in that anxious, listening way dogs have. She never did that without reason. I put my glass down and listened. For a while, there was nothing but the far highway and the faint thunk of a screen door down the block. I thought maybe wind had died away. That happens sometimes in the valleys, little pockets of perfect stillness where the air holds. Then the porch bulb dimmed. Not a flicker or a pop, it softened like someone let the wattage down. The light pool across the steps thinned and a bar of the swing chair threw a longer shadow. I told myself the bulb was old and that I'd replace it in the morning. I told myself many small, sensible things that night. The porch light brightened again after a few heartbeats, steady and normal, and I settled back. A little later, the clock on the stove, the kind with green LED numbers, blipped. It jumped forward by 2 minutes, then back. The soundless tick of the kitchen clock settling felt oddly loud in a night that had lost its crickets. I picked up my phone to check the time. The screen showed a single bar and the tiny circle of searching that means the network was on vacation. My thumb hovered over the screen like I might prod it back into life. Rosie gave a small bark at the maple and stood up. She padded to the edge of the porch and peered into the yard, tail not wagging, just tense. I went with her and leaned on the rail. The sky glittered. The maple's leaves were black cutouts against it. You could see Orion if you knew where to look. I know because I used to drag my kids out to the park and name the shapes. A single star on the left side of the sky caught my eye. It was one of those first bright ones, maybe a planet even. It hung steady and white. I watched it for no reason other than habit. And then the star brightened. Not slowly, not like the way light seems to bloom when cloud thins. It brightened fast. In the space of a breath, it went from a distant pin to something like a small, very distant bulb turned up to a glare. The change was instantaneous enough that it felt like a cut. The whole yard filled with a soft, pale light that wasn't warm the way porch light is. It was cool, almost silver. It flattened colors into a high-contrast sketch. Roses that had been coral took on a hard white edge. The grass showed each blade like the slats of a paintbrush. When the light hit us, I felt the hairs along my forearms stand up. The air didn't change temperature. If anything, it felt a degree thinner, like the night had been sipped. The light was not a beam. It didn't have a cone or a focused source. It was like the sky had decided to be a lamp, and the lamp had been set on the map of my yard. Shadows sharpened immediately. The house across the street, dark and shuttered, looked as if someone had taken a photograph and pushed the exposure. Even Rosie's eyes reflected the silver in a way I'd never seen. The first thought was practical. Someone with a flashlight on the hill, a sport camera, a spotlight from a truck. But the glow didn't move like any of those things. It didn't come from the road. It came from the sky, up where stars live. It wasn't a plane. I would have heard a motor or seen strobes. There was no sound beyond the distant highway and that small, tight noise of my chest. I called my name out because calling your own name is a thing you can do when the night stretches and you want someone else to witness it, to fold it into normal. Evan, I said, come here. My husband's voice floated from the kitchen window where he'd been fixing something sensible. He always tucks tools away by the sink, and when he answered, I could hear his feet on the tile. I said, outside, now. It was stupidly abrupt, and I knew it, but I wanted him there. By the time he came to the door, the light had eased. The star had returned to its ordinary pin, and the yard had the same gold puddle on the steps from the porch bulb. Evan stepped out, rubbing his hands like he was cold, though the air wasn't. What? He started. The star, I said. It lit up the whole yard. My voice sounded very small. I had the sense of saying something that would make him fold it into a sensible story. Some electrical blip, neighborhood prank, but the tremor in my hands made me honest. He looked up where I'd been looking and squinted. The pinprick of the star was there, innocent and wrong. I don't see anything, he said after a second, like he might have missed the end of my sentence or the point altogether. He came closer and put an arm around my shoulders, the way he does when someone else is rattled. You sure you didn't just catch lightning or a plane? He asked. No, I said. It was bright. It lit everything, like daylight. I told him how the shadows had become sharp and how the roses looked white-edged. I told him Rosie had looked at the sky like she'd seen a person. He listened the way he always does, slow and available, and then, without meaning to sound unhelpful, he said, maybe your eyes were tired. We stood there in the cooling gold of the porch bulb, and I watched his face look for the practical thing. He was trying on reasons the same way someone tries on coats to see which fit. I wanted him to say, I saw it too, because shared witnesses make events less slippery. But he didn't. He only said, want me to check the street? And I said yes. He walked to the edge of the yard, down the path, and leaned over the low fence. The street was the same as always, a parked car near the lamppost, a silhouette of a man walking his dog farther down, the soft orange of sodium lights. He checked over his shoulder and then came back without looking alarmed. Nothing odd, he said. He tried the radio in the kitchen, flipped through channels. The tiny blue LED on the stove blinked its clock, the same numbers as before, 11:43, and didn't stutter. The router's little light kept blinking its polite pattern. My phone, which had shown 1 bar, came back to full signal as if the world had never been absent for a second. The porch bulb held steady. The sky, to everything else, behaved like an old friend. I kept thinking about the light while he made us tea. I kept replaying that instant where the yard went from ordinary to near daylight, and how the roses looked like they'd been sketched in white. I felt silly and small for being thrown by a blink of brightness, but a part of me had been unsettled in a way I couldn't name. The ordinary things of the house, mug handle, tea steam, the soft ticking of the clock, were a small, precise proof that the world had not ended, not even a little. We didn't tell anyone. Who would you tell? I thought of calling the neighbor who charts weather out of habit. I thought of the city police or an astronomer at the university, and then the practical pile formed again. You have patients in the morning, bills, a child's rehearsal. The list of what must be done shrank the night down to normal size. I wrote a note and left it in my phone. Saw a bright skylight, 11:38 p.m. No details, just a stub of evidence. That night I woke twice and went to the window because habit is an odd form of superstitious logic. The sky was the same as it had been before. Stars, moon bit in a sliver. Rosie slept in her crate, lungs slow and steady. The next evening, the news was full of a local council meeting about zoning, nothing about lights or sky phenomena. The week after that, I walked the yard in daylight and looked for any scorch on the grass, a melted leaf, anything to explain the intensity of the brightness. There was nothing unusual, just the ordinary tracks of the sprinklers and the faint ring where a bird had pecked last week. Sometimes I caught myself staring up, waiting for the star to flare like a hand turning a switch. I kept expecting some repeat, a pattern, a reason. Life resumed its usual steady sequence: work, dinner, the town routine. The note on my phone sat there like a small relic. Saw a bright skylight, 11:38 p.m. I read it sometimes, like reading an odd sentence someone else had written about the world. I don't have a tidy explanation. I only have the memory of that sudden high white light, the way it sharpened shadows and flattened color. And the fact that by the time Evan reached the porch, the sky had closed its mouth and resumed the business of being night. The garden looked the same as it always had, the roses no paler than before, and the maple's leaves resumed being nothing more than leaves against the sky. The event folded itself into the night with the quiet persistence of some things that don't need telling. I left the bar a little past 3 because closing time sneaks up and because the back roads are faster when no one's crawling the highway. The town sat asleep under those half-lit sodium lamps, and the rain from earlier had left the asphalt like glass. I slid into my car, an old sedan with too many miles, and headed out Route 7 the way I always do. Windows cracked a hair to keep me awake, playlist low, thinking about nothing harder than getting home. It was colder than the forecast said it would be, a thin cold that gets under your collar. The fields were black shapes on either side of the road, and the tree line was a hard, dark line against the clouds. Maybe half a mile in, I noticed the birds had stopped. Not gone quiet gradually, just stopped. For a second, there was nothing but the hum of the engine and the steady slap of the wipers on a film of leftover drizzle. That small, wrong silence put a weight in my chest. A pause in the flow of things that said something in the world had shifted. A light caught my eye in the trees to the right, low among the trunks. At first, I figured a hunting truck had its headlamp aimed the wrong way, or some kid had a flashlight. It was a single point, white and steady, sitting maybe 30 or 40 yards off the road. I thought nothing of it and kept driving. Then it started moving. Not jumping around like an animal or jerking like a flashlight sweeping, it paced alongside my car, level with the hood but tucked into the trees, so all I could see was that pin of light. I eased my foot off the gas without thinking, because you do that. Slow down to see if the other driver is okay, or if something's on the road. The light matched my speed. I nudged the accelerator. It nudged too. It stayed perfectly parallel, like an invisible car was driving beside me in the ditch. I told myself there had to be a road behind those trees I didn't know about, some backtrack where a trucker was doing the same route as me. But every time I glanced through the branches, there was only trunks, saplings, thick underbrush. When I edged nearer the shoulder to see better, the light kept pace without a problem. It didn't flash, it didn't throw a beam into the road, and it didn't cast any visible reflection on the wet pavement. It was just there, where my side mirror could pick it up as a steady pin. The radio did something then that I couldn't bring myself to ignore. One moment it was playing some half-remembered old song, the next it slammed to static, and that static wasn't the normal kind. It was clean and flat like someone had turned a whiteboard on. Then a faint hum threaded through the noise. Too low to be a note, and too steady to be the heater. The hum cut out at the exact same time the light leaned forward a touch, as if to peer through the trees. My dashboard clock, which I had ignored all night, blinked once and then reset to 12. I told myself the car was tired, the battery being old, making the electronics hiccup. Batteries hiccup. Cars hiccup. People don't have to scare themselves. A fox crossed the road up ahead, moved fast and low, and for all the dramatic speed, it didn't look startled. It kept its head down and its tail tucked like it was on a job. A herd of deer would have barged through this part of the county in season. That night, nothing else appeared. No headlights anywhere on the horizon, not a single distant shape. The light kept near the tree line as if it were following the contour of the woods rather than any path a person would take. I slowed to 40 because that's what you do when you want to test something quietly. The light slackened with me. I rolled to 30 and it eased back too. I put the car in cruise and watched the mirror. The reflection of my taillight hung red and dull. Next to it, the white pin moved in deliberate patience. I looked up into the trees, expecting a thin track where a person might walk, or some reflective jacket catching the lamp, but nothing in the brush answered for it. I thought of stopping, stepping out with a flashlight, and knocking on whatever had the light powered up. Curiosity and an old stubbornness that's never let me just let things be. But there was also the practical list in the back of my head. Kids in the house, the dog to feed, the knock of rent next week. Rational things that tell you to keep the engine running and get home. So I drove. I pushed the gas and took the lane up to the legal limit, then past it. The needle on the speedo climbed, and the trees blurred. The light matched me every mile, whether I was doing 50, 60, or near 70 on the straighter stretches. When I cut through a curve, it mirrored my line. When the road narrowed under a low branch, I felt my tires shift on the wet tarmac, and the light tucked in like someone cupping a hand around a candle. It was patient but persistent. It never cut ahead or fell behind. It did not reflect off the paint in my side mirror the way another car's headlight would. It simply held that place in the dark, as if it had all the time in the world. At one point, I flashed my high beams reflexively at thin air, old habits from years of rural driving, and the light didn't blink in response. I should have seen it flinch if it had been a human with a torch. Nothing. For the first time since I'd noticed it, a small, cold fear threaded through me. Not the kind where you bolt the doors and run, but an inner tightening that made my hands grip the wheel until my knuckles blanched. My phone, which I finally unclipped to get a picture, gave me a battery icon and the words, "No service." I tapped the camera, then cursed when it showed only a gray smear where the trees were. I took a shot anyway and scrolled it open, blank. The screen showed a faint smear and a cursor for the file name, but no light to match what I'd seen with my own eyes. I tried video and held the phone out the window for a couple of seconds. The file saved and played back a couple of fuzzy frames with nothing but tree silhouettes. I put the phone back in my pocket because it felt ridiculous to keep waving it around like a child. There were other small things. A mile marker post near the bend, the one with a little reflector they put there so you don't go off in the dark, had been missing. I'd passed it 100 times and tonight it was gone, the metal post replaced with only disturbed grass. My left tire hit a shallow rut where it normally didn't exist, and the steering tugged without warning before the car steadied. The wipers skipped once on the windshield and then clipped at a different rate like a metronome gone wrong. Instruments I trusted for years had decided to act up in minor ways that, placed together, tabulated into a worry. Then the tree line opened, and I hit the last stretch of road before the town lights, the old Miller Bridge, a span that creaks and smells of river in spring. The glow stayed with me right up to the bridge's white railing. As I reached the first street lamp of the town, the light finally did something I hadn't seen it do before. It slowed its pace to match the slow roll of the edge of the town and held there, right in the trees lining the municipal lot. It did not speed ahead into the town. It did not dart away. It hovered, patient like it had been waiting for this moment. I felt my shoulders unclench a little as traffic lights showed ahead, warming the sky in the little orange halo that means people and noise and the sort of normal where strangers use turn signals. The light in the trees blinked once and then, just like that, it was gone. No movement, no flaring out, nothing to mark its exit. One moment a pin in the black, the next moment there was only uninterrupted dark and a gull call from the river that sounded ordinary in its inconsequence. I drove the rest of the way through town with the windows up, the radio back to low-volume talk shows. People were at the diner at that hour, old men with coffee and paper, and I half expected someone to joke about lights in the trees. But nobody mentioned anything to me when I stopped at the light. I could have pulled into a parking lot and called the police, tried to get someone to come out and see if there'd been a hunter, a photographer with a lantern, a prankster with some flair. But the town felt ordinary and awake and stubbornly uninterested. At my driveway, I killed the engine and sat a long time with my hands still on the wheel. The house was dark but lived in. A light in the kitchen clicked on when Jess, my wife, murmured my name from the doorway, asking if I'd brought milk. I walked up the steps, and she met me halfway with a mug already poured. She laughed softly when I told her I'd been followed by a light, but the laugh held the shape of someone humoring a late-night story. "Maybe a hunter with a headlamp," she said, reasonable and good. I wanted to say more, about the radio and the missing post and the way the light had kept pace as if it had been driving its own road, but I didn't. Saying the details out loud makes them real, and part of me wanted to keep it folded away like a note you tuck into a drawer. That night, I slept badly, waking a few times to check the window and see nothing but the porch lamp and distant cars. My phone, when I checked it in the morning, had the photo files, but each one showed only trees and black sky. Nothing that matched the sensation of the light pacing me. I told a buddy at work about it a week later over a smoke. He said it might have been a photographer or some county crew with a survey lamp. Practical answers. They lined up like ducks in a row, and I wanted to pass them one by one off my list and close the file. And yet, every time I drive that stretch by daylight, now I look at the tree line where the pin had been and wonder what kept pace with me in the wet dark. There's a small space in my memory where the white dot sits, patient and parallel, neither threatening nor friendly. And I keep thinking about how the world can fold itself into a small event that changes the feeling of the road. I don't know what it was. I only know I drove, and it drove beside me, and then it stopped being there when the town began. It was past 1 a.m. when it happened. Me and Kyle had left Marcy's place after one of her low-key Friday hangouts. We didn't stay late often, but we'd gotten caught up talking about some movie, and the time slipped by. Neither of us had a car then, and it wasn't worth calling an Uber for the 10-minute walk back to our side of town. The air was cool, a little damp like it might rain later, and the streets were empty. We cut through Maple Avenue, which is one of those stretches of cracked sidewalks and half-working streetlights. A couple of them flickered while we passed, buzzing faintly, but it was mostly dark. I had my hoodie up and my hands stuffed in my pockets. Kyle was a step ahead, carrying the leftovers Marcy had shoved at us in a foil tray. We weren't talking much by then, just the kind of tired quiet that comes when the night's over. About halfway down the block, I noticed something weird on the pavement. My shadow stretched long in front of me, which made no sense because the nearest streetlight was behind us. I stopped walking and looked down harder, like maybe I was imagining it. But it wasn't just me. Kyle's shadow stretched the opposite way, toward me, like we were being lit from 2 different angles at once. "Dude," I said, pointing. He stopped and looked down, then back at me, then back at the ground. What the hell? Our shadows overlapped in this strange way, pulling toward each other from opposite sides. For a second, I thought maybe a car was coming, headlights sweeping across us, but there was no sound, no engine, no glow moving along the street. Everything was still. We both turned upward at the same time. Nothing. Just a clear night sky, the faint glow of the town, a few blocks, some clouds way off near the horizon. No plane lights, no drone buzzing overhead, nothing at all. I remember the silence most. It wasn't total. I could hear a distant dog barking, the hum of a refrigerator in one of the houses, but it was thick, like the air was holding still. "Okay, that's creepy," Kyle muttered. He pulled out his phone, but the screen didn't come on. He tapped the button a few times, shook it, muttered something about his battery dying. I reached for mine and had the same problem. The screen lit up for half a second, then went black. Both of our phones dead at the same time, even though I knew mine had been at 70% when we left. That made us both uneasy. We stood there in the middle of the sidewalk, shadows stretching in those impossible directions, dead phones in our hands. Neither of us said it, but I think we both felt the urge to just keep walking. So we did. As soon as we moved, our shadows snapped back to normal, stretching behind us like they should, lit by the streetlight at the end of the block. We both stopped again, looking down, then back up. Still nothing in the sky. Kyle let out this half-nervous laugh. Guess we're sleep deprived or something? I didn't answer because I wasn't convinced. My skin felt tight, like every hair on my arms was standing up. I told him I wanted to get off Maple and cut through the park instead. It wasn't exactly shorter, but it felt better than walking that same stretch of sidewalk with the streetlights sputtering. The park was even darker. The lamps there had been busted for years, so it was just patches of moonlight between the trees. Our footsteps on the gravel path sounded way too loud. About halfway through, I heard something overhead. Not loud, not even distinct, just this soft, rushing sound like wind moving fast but in one concentrated spot. I stopped and glanced up. Again, nothing. Just black sky and scattered stars. Kyle froze too. "You heard that?" I said. My voice sounded thin in the dark. We stood there until it faded. It didn't trail off like a plane. It just stopped. Then the park lights, the ones that had been broken for as long as I could remember, flickered on all at once. Not bright, just a weak orange glow that buzzed overhead. They stayed on maybe 10 seconds before shutting back off. We were left blinking in the dark again. Kyle swore under his breath and started walking faster. I followed. Neither of us said much until we were out of the park and back onto regular streets. That's when I noticed the weirdest part. As we passed the row of houses on Birch Street, motion lights started tripping ahead of us, one after the other, like something was moving just out of sight. The lights would blink on in the yard ahead, then go dark as we passed, then the next one would flare. It wasn't in sync with our movement. It was always one house ahead, like something invisible was pacing us. Kyle saw it too. He kept glancing from the yards to me, waiting for me to say something. But what was there to say? By the time we reached my place, both of our phones buzzed back to life at the same time. His lit up with a bunch of missed notifications. Mine jumped from black screen straight to the lock screen with the same 70% battery it had before. No restart, no delay, just suddenly working again. We didn't talk much when we split off. He lived another 2 blocks over, but he didn't want me walking with him. I think he just wanted it to be over. Inside my room, I plugged in my phone and sat by the window, watching the street for a long time. Nothing else happened. The night looked like any other, but I still think about those shadows, pulling in opposite directions under an empty sky. It wasn't headlights, it wasn't moonlight. It was something above us, and we couldn't see it. We got to the campsite just as the sun was dipping behind the ridge. There were 4 of us, me, my brother Mark, his friend Lisa, and my buddy Jordan. The trailhead was nearly empty, which was fine. We'd all been itching for a quiet weekend in the mountains without anyone else around. We set up in a small clearing just off the main path, enough space for the tents and a fire ring that looked like it hadn't been used in a while. The air was dry, the sort that scratches at your throat when you take a deep breath. Once the tents were up, Mark and Jordan started gathering firewood while Lisa and I unpacked our gear. The forest was quiet in that typical late summer way. Occasional birds, a breeze stirring the needles, distant water from the stream down the hill. Nothing unusual. We got the fire going around 8 p.m., just as the last of the light faded. The flames were small at first, flickering over logs that had been sitting in the sun all day, warm and dry. We were talking about the hike earlier, joking about the old ranger station that's supposedly haunted, when I noticed something off about the fire. The shadows it cast didn't stay close to the ground. I blinked, thinking I was seeing things. The darkness around the fire seemed to stretch upward, like the flames were pulling the shadows along the trees, not just across the clearing. "Do you guys see that?" I asked, squinting. "What?" Mark said, tossing another log on the fire. "The shadows, they're moving wrong," I said, "like they're climbing the trees or something." Lisa leaned forward. "You mean just flickering?" "No," I said. "They're going up, not sideways, not from the fire's angle, straight up, like they're being pulled." Jordan laughed, though it didn't sound right. "You're seeing things, man. Firelight does weird stuff in the dark." I thought that too at first, but then the air felt heavier, like the night had compressed around us. The breeze stopped, even though the trees were still moving slightly in the wind a few hundred feet away. The forest was quiet in a way that made my skin itch. And then we saw it. A faint light, pale and diffuse, moving above us. Not a flashlight or a lantern, nothing that could be coming from the ground. It drifted silently over the clearing, over our heads, just above the trees. The glow was subtle, the kind you notice more out of the corner of your eye at first, then suddenly can't ignore. Lisa whispered, "Is that?" I nodded. "I think so." It moved slowly, hovering just above the tallest pines. The shadows from the fire stretched higher, almost like they were leaning toward it. There was no sound, no hum, no wind, nothing, but the presence of it made the air feel thicker. My chest tightened without realizing it. We all stayed frozen for a few minutes, just watching. Mark kept his hands on his knees, leaning forward. Jordan's jaw was tight, and Lisa's eyes were wide, unblinking. The light drifted in a smooth path, not a random float like a drone or a bird, more like it knew the contours of the trees, the space of our clearing, and was moving deliberately through it. I tried to rationalize. Maybe some scientific study, someone testing something in the forest? But it didn't make sense. The nearest road was miles away. No one was supposed to be in the woods at this hour. No traffic, no planes, nothing that could account for a light moving so slowly, so steadily, overhead. The fire shifted a little, logs cracking, and the shadows rippled. The shadows didn't just sway, they seemed to rise, stretching toward the canopy as if the light above was pulling them upward. I stared at them, feeling a strange vertigo, like the ground beneath the fire was tilting even though the rest of the clearing stayed level. Then, the glow passed directly overhead, pale, silent, stretching across the small clearing before moving toward the ridge in the distance. It was barely brighter than moonlight, but it illuminated the edges of the nearest branches, the tips of the needles, and for a moment, everything looked almost like it wasn't part of this world. And then it was gone. No hum, no residual light, no shift in the air. Just normal dark, the fire flickering normally, shadows back on the ground as they should be. The breeze returned, gentle and ordinary. The forest smelled the same as it had when we arrived. The clearing seemed exactly as it had always been. We sat there in silence for a while, listening to the normal sounds of the night. Crickets, the distant stream, the occasional rustle of leaves. Nothing else moved. Nothing else glowed. I felt my chest unclench slowly, but I was still tense, still staring at the trees where the light had disappeared. Eventually, Jordan spoke. "Okay, well, I guess that happened." Mark laughed nervously. "Yeah, totally normal." Lisa shook her head. "That wasn't normal. You saw it too, right?" I nodded. "Everyone saw it." We didn't talk about it much after that. We finished our dinner, packed away some of the firewood, and tried to act normal. None of us could sleep right away. Every crack of a branch, every shadow in the trees made us tense. In the morning, everything looked ordinary. The clearing was quiet, the fire pit cold, the shadows normal. There was no sign that anything unusual had happened. We packed up, hiked back to the trailhead, and drove down the forest road toward town. Even now, I think about that light and the way the shadows bent toward it. I've been back to that area during the day, and it looks like any other patch of forest. But the memory of that pale glow drifting over the trees, silent and deliberate, and the shadows stretching up toward it, stays with me. Sometimes when I'm back in my own yard at dusk, I catch the shadows flickering oddly in the light of the street lamps and think about that night. I know it was real, or at least, it felt real. And part of me expects that glow to appear again, just for a moment, drifting through the trees and making everything in its path feel off. I was finishing up the last of the night checks when I first noticed the roof. It was a Thursday in late October, a clear, cold night where the air had a bite to it and you could see the whole sky like somebody had pulled back a sheet. I was supposed to be inside, coffee gone cold, thermostat nudged up, but I like to walk the yard before bed, see that everything looks like it should. The cows were quiet in the barn, chewing slow, and the big floodlight by the shop hummed the way it always hums. The silo sits a little way from the house, a round metal cylinder that fights weather and time. It holds most of next spring's feed. I keep tabs on it because if something goes wrong with the vent or the roof, it can get expensive quick. I'd been out in the fields all day hauling bales and fixing a flat on the baler, so when the radio in the truck started giving me that low static on the drive back, I shrugged it off. Static happens. Old wiring, old batteries. I swung the truck around, killed the engine, and the yard went quiet except for my boots on the gravel. First odd thing, the dog. Hank, my old border collie, followed me out to the yard and then stopped a full 10 feet from the silo and sat hard, ears forward, eyes fixed. He doesn't do that unless there's a hawk or a raccoon in the yard. He didn't bark. He stayed still, breathing like a metronome. That made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Second odd thing, the radio. When I killed the engine, the hand radio on the workbench in the shop clicked and brightened with the same static I'd been hearing driving past the apple trees. It wasn't the usual farm chatter, no trucks, no weather warning, just a thin buzz, like a mosquito far away. I went to shut the shop light off to go inside, and the bulb dimmed for a second. That annoyed me. I figured I'd been unlucky with a loose connection and went to the house to get a couple of new bulbs. On the porch, I paused, because the yard looked wrong in the floodlight. The metal roof of the silo was bright, too bright for a dark sky, and it flashed in a rhythm. Not a real flash like a camera, more of a reflective glitter, like the moon hitting wet chrome. Then it stopped. I thought maybe a cloud had passed the moon and left the reflection in pieces, but the moon was a pale sliver and behind high, thin clouds that didn't usually make the roof wink in patterns. I walked closer. Hank trailed me, but kept his distance, solemn. Up close, the roof looked like any other corrugated metal roof, dull, weathered, some rust streaks near the screws. When I stood with my hands on my hips, the roof seemed to pulse in a rhythm that matched my pulse if I let my fingers find it. I thought of an honest explanation, a farm light in town somewhere, a hunter with a spotlight. But the yard was a long stretch before any road, and the nearest neighbor was a mile away. Third odd thing, the animals. The cows in the next field had gone quiet, unnervingly quiet. You could usually hear at least one of them shift and sigh. That night they were a block of dark shapes against the field. Even the barn cats had stopped their usual circling and sat on the rafters like they'd been put there. I told myself, animals do strange things when the barometer drops or when a tractor starts up at odd hours. But the air felt like glass and everything had the wrong volume. I noticed the pulsing light in the sky after I'd been watching the roof for maybe 5 minutes. High and separate, above the tree line and over toward the west, there was a pale point of light. It wasn't a plane, no moving strobes, no steady flight path. It pulsed the same way the roof did. I tested that thought with a small movement of my head, and the flicker synced with the roof like a mirror. When the light in the sky brightened slightly, the rooftop shimmered in the same instant. When it dimmed, so did the roof. They were matching each other. My first real response was practical, check for wiring. I turned my flashlight on and walked the perimeter to the feed line that runs up to the old electric post near the silo. The pole was fine. The insulators were not cracked. Nothing was arcing. If it was a stray bulb somewhere, I couldn't find it. I walked back and looked up, and the light was still there, pulsing like a heartbeat. Something else happened that didn't make any sense. My phone died. The screen went black, and when I turned it back on, it said no service. I know the dead spots in the yard, those pockets where the trees chew up a signal, but wake the phone dead? That was a first. The clock on my dashboard reset too, then spun for a second before it set back to the right time like nothing had happened. Phones lie sometimes, wiring lies sometimes, but these little lies stacked on top of each other felt heavy. I moved to the ladder against the local barn because I figured if anything was going on with the roof, it might be easier to see from a higher angle. Hank wouldn't follow. He sat, eyes on the sky. I climbed, boots creaking on the rungs, and the wind was nil, the kind of stillness where a loose piece of hay will hang in midair. At the top of the ladder, the pulsing was clearer. The light in the sky was the size of my fist held at arm's length. Just a soft pale that didn't have color like red or green. It pulsed in a slow, steady pattern, one long, one short, two long, like sunspots breathing. Along with the pulse came a pressure change in my ears, a pop the way you feel on a plane. I felt a lightness, not in the head, but down behind the sternum, like someone had opened a window inside me and breeze had tugged at everything loose. I sat on the rung to steady myself, and for a second I thought about calling the neighbor, Ed. But my phone wouldn't make the call. I can see his house from here. His porch light was off, and everything there looked normal. Then the roof's metal did something I hadn't expected. The entire top lip of the silo, the circular seam where the roof meets the cylinder, brightened in a pulse of reflected light that matched the sky. It was like someone had painted the rim with quicksilver and tapped it in time with the star. The metal didn't glow on its own, it flashed in that same slow rhythm. When the skylight held steady, the roof shimmered steadily. If the skylight cut out, the roof stopped. I climbed down and stood near the silo's base. I put my hand on the cool metal, expecting heat or charge, but there was nothing unusual, just the cold of the night and a little grit. I ran my gloved fingers along the seam. No scorch marks, no pits, nothing. It was untouched. I called to Hank to come and he rose, shook himself, and trotted over like he'd been pretending all along. The skylight hovered where it was for maybe 10 minutes. During that time, other strange, smaller things happened. The clock on the barn's alarm set jumped ahead a minute without ticking, then eased back as if it had settled. A tractor in the far field clicked into a higher idle, then back down for no reason. I watched a moth circle the floodlight, then stop midair and hang like a speck of dust. I felt both foolish and needing to know more. Maybe I could make it move if I waved a flashlight up at it, or maybe I could get a picture. I went back to the truck and dug for my camera. The battery read 87% when I checked. I clicked it. The display came alive, but when I pointed it at the light, the image was a smear of gray, like the sensor couldn't decide what to show. I took the shot anyway. Later, on the computer, the file was just a smear too. No evidence, only noise. And then it stopped. 1 second, the sky was pulsing. The next second, the light folded as if someone had pressed a hand over a lantern. The shine on the silo snapped out at the exact same moment. The air pressure returned to normal with the same little pop that had announced its arrival. The radio hummed back to life in the shop, and the barn clock ticked on without skipping. Hank barked once, short and surprised, then trotted in circles like nothing had happened. The night set back into its usual rhythm, and the stars resumed their steady, indifferent glitter. I walked up the gravel driveway to the house and didn't tell anyone right away. Why say something you couldn't prove? My wife would ask sensible questions, and Ed across the lane would say he'd been out splitting wood and never noticed a thing. I went inside, brewed coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with my elbows on the wood until it stained my skin. The kettle clicked and the radio hummed with the local evening call-in show like it had before. I kept looking out the window toward the silo. It looked ordinary, plain under the moon, as if nothing extraordinary had just been projected across the metal. The next morning, I inspected the silo by daylight. I walked the ladder up and ran my hand along the seam, checking the bolts and the ring girders. Everything looked, to the eye, exactly as it had the week before. No burns, no pitting, no scorch marks. The men at the feed mill joked when I went in to buy a sack of mineral supplement. Trucks have mirrors that catch light, they said. Or maybe stray alley lights from the highway. Their voices made sense and filled the room. They'd seen odd reflections before, so had I. But those were ordinary explanations. But for a few nights after, when I took the last walk before bed, I'd find Hank sitting in the exact same spot, watching the west. He never howled, never barked. He just watched like a man staring for something he couldn't name. I kept waiting to see the light again, half hoping I'd get a better look, and half dreading it. It didn't return. The silo looked normal enough from the road, same rust streaks, same dent on the south side. The world kept its ordinary pace, feeding, milking, fixing fences, the things that have to be done whether the sky makes sense or not. I chalked the night up to an unexplainable scratch on the record of things that happen in a long life on a farm. I told Ed about the pulsing once over the fence and he nodded, then changed the subject to corn prices, and the sound of him talking about the coming winter filled the space. I still go out to check the roof on clear nights. I take Hank because he likes the walk and because he's a sensible company. Sometimes I look up and search the west, where the light had been, and sometimes the stars are so sharp they seem to be cut with a ruler. Mostly there's nothing there but stars and the way they always have been. The roof glints in the moon now and then in the ordinary fashion, and I run my hand along the seam and feel the cold metal and the grit. And That's the story I keep. The night something odd lit the rim of the silo and then it stopped, leaving everything appearing completely normal.